Hey folks, welcome to Heroscape Stratagems, the fireside chat designed to get you to the next level of Heroscape play faster than gain high ground. With me is the king of long-form Heroscape content, DogginDays. Welcome to the channel.
I appreciate it, man. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm very excited to have you here. And speaking of kings, I brought DogginDays here to discuss a topic that is very near to both of us, which is king builds. Now, Webster's dictionary defines king builds as any build which relies on a single figure to produce the large majority of the damage each game and has its potential for damage drastically reduced if said figure is destroyed. Now, this might sound like I just said the same thing twice, but let me clarify the difference. Picture this as a Venn diagram. On the right are armies that rely on a single figure to produce the vast majority of the damage each game. And on the left are armies that have its potential for damage drastically reduced if a single figure is destroyed. And in the middle are king builds. Let's go through some examples to help clarify. Melee bonding falls very nicely on the left. Melee bonding often has support figures that greatly increase their potential for damage. Sir Gilbert, Marcus Decimus Gallus, and Grimnack are great examples. If they die, the attack output of the knights, Romans, and orcs falls. However, those armies are not relying on those figures to produce the damage themselves. Rather, those figures boost the damage potential of those armies by providing significant buffs to the squad figures in various ways, such as movement, attack, or defense boosts. And on the other side, we have armies that rely on a single figure to produce the vast majority of the damage each game. This would be an army like Major Q9 and Rygarn, which is a Valhalla Customs or VC unit that allows you to shift an order marker once per round. In this build, players take Major Q9 and a number of filler units designed to deal with different scenarios. Popular choices are VC's Brute and the classic Mara Warriors. While Major Q9 is intended to make most of the attacks in a game, if he should fall, the other pieces are there to close out the game. I would also argue that sort of a strange ranged screen army such as Savaris, Raylan, and the Warriors of Ashra also fall into this category. The army is relying primarily on Savaris to produce the damage from afar, but if Savaris should fall or the enemy get too close, the Ashra are more than capable of dealing damage on their own. These are edge cases, and in most instances, if an army relies on a single figure to produce the vast majority of the damage, it is a king build. However, these distinctions can be useful to delineate between when a build is a king build and when it is a different army archetype. And we're actually going to get into some of those discrepancies as we start to talk about these units. If you are not familiar with BC units, I would highly recommend you take a look at the link below, as we'll be talking about a bunch of them throughout this discussion. These community-approved customs are welcome in most tournaments around the country and may even be at a tournament near you. Here is a short list of king builds that operate in modern VC-inclusive Heroscape, whether good or bad. This list actually focuses on the squads rather than the kings in order to shorten the list, as often these armies can choose from a variety of units to lead with. These builds are Greenscales and any dragon, the Fjord-like spiders and Quahan or Sujoa, the Amberhide protectors and any large insect, Death Reavers plus a unique ranged unit such as Major Q9, but potentially Major Q10, the Krav Maga agents, the Vulcan Mech Incendiborgs, even a dragon, etc. The Arrogruts and Mimring, with no Swag Riders and no Krug as a substitute or backup bonder, and the Martin Nagrubs and the Hive Lord. DogginDays and I are here in the chairs today because we both have a love for a certain king build. His is those tasty Nagrubs, and mine is Greenscales. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what made you fall in love with the Hive Lords?
Yeah, man, thanks. So I have only been playing competitive Heroscape for a little over a year now, and part of that is because I didn't realize that there was a competitive scene in my area. I grew up with Heroscape, but I always thought it was in different parts of the country, and I just thought, oh, I'll just play Heroscape with my friends, try to understand it that way. But I did kind of follow the community in the background. I read the forums and stuff, and I listened to, Casters of Valhalla and some other YouTube channels. But to specifically answer your question, I was really interested in Torkulna. I think it started in looking at Torkulna's card and the stats on his card and his ability to heal himself. A lot of dragons, like I think of Nilfheim. Nilfheim has 6 life, 6 attack, and 4 defense, and Nilfheim's great. But Torkulna has 5 defense, and so when you pair that with the fact that he can eat a Nagrub and heal his wounds, I thought he's really, really tough to kill if you can protect him, and I don't know. I don't know when that happened in my life, but ever since I just kind of had that realization, I kind of wanted to just study the army. And I think I got even more invested in it. There was one episode of the Casters podcast where they specifically did kind of what we're doing, where they talked about king builds, and they specifically focused on Greenscales and Nagrubs. And I think one of them said the army was good, and then I've heard other members of the podcast say that they weren't. And I just kind of thought, you know what, I'm going to make the army work. I think it's good. I think it has potential. And then I remember I got in touch with my current competitive group through Sir Heroscape. I don't know if Sir Heroscape was watching, but he pointed me to a link where it's like, oh yeah, there's a group in your area. And I don't think I ever thanked him for it, but ever since then, I found a great group of people, been playing lots of competitive Heroscape, and I've taken Torkulna, the Nagrubs, and Raylin to 2 different tournaments, and that might become 3 in time. And I have grilled this particular army and variations of it. It's usually Torkulna, at least 3 Nagrubs, and Raylin, and then whatever filler I have in that, whatever points left I have for filler in that format. And I've played it tons of times. I've compiled notes on it. And it's just one of those armies that I want to figure out. There's a lot going on with it. I think it's a great starter army for people who are new into Heroscape because it's all fairly affordable figures. They're all master set figures, and it teaches a new player about bonding. It's a great army to get into the game with, but it's also a hard army to master, especially, and I'm sure we'll get into the different ways you can build it, but especially when you have Raylin, there are considerations of when do you move Raylin, how do you move your Nagrubs, what jobs do you send your Nagrubs out, and then how do you deal with bad matchups? And yeah, I could go on and on, but I really like this army. It's one that I'm trying to study and figure out, and it's just kind of it's made me fascinated with king builds in general, just because I like that spectacle of you've invested almost, if not more than half your points into one figure. You have to protect that figure. He will do work for you if you protect him. If you take care of him, he will pay dividends. But if you squander him and lose him, you're cooked. So I kind of like that extra layer of intensity in a game. So yeah, for that and many other reasons, I love that army, and super excited to talk about these king builds with you, Mo.
Yeah, we will let you go on and on in a little bit here when we get to the Nagrubs. Those are excellent points. That is such a quintessential aspect of Heroscape that anyone can pick it up and play it first time, and yet years and years of playing an army, and you still feel like you're discovering things about even just a single unit or two like that.
Absolutely.
That just really speaks to the depth of the game. You did remind me, we should shout out the Casters of Valhalla podcast. They did a discussion on king builds. I believe it's episode 22. Don't quote me on that though. The differences between that episode, the reasons why I think this is necessary is, first of all, they didn't have my opinion on there, which as an online player, it doesn't count for much, but I think it is important. Second of all, they only covered classic scape figures, which is their specialty, and that's fantastic. But we are going to cover VC units, which again, if you're unfamiliar, I'll leave a link in the description somewhere where you can go check out all of the fantastic units that have come out. Valhalla's Customs is big enough now that any truly modern competitive scape player probably should have some understanding. And frankly, any casual scape player should pick up the 4 or 5 units that are most interesting to them, because I guarantee you, if you have a classic figure or unit that you love, there is something that makes them even more fun to play with. And the third reason to talk about this is that there are now new options for king builds in what is considered classic scape, technically contemporary scape, new Age of Annihilation designs. And frankly, I am probably ill prepared to talk about them. There's one unit that was literally just revealed like a couple of weeks ago, after we had even planned this whole discussion. So we will touch on those briefly, but they're important to mention as options. That Casters of Valhalla episodes is a couple of years old, and competitive scape has changed a lot even in the last few years since then. So I think it's important to have an updated discussion about these things, especially in light of Age of Annihilation, all of the new VC customs out, and that sort of thing. So, and I will also add, my love for Greenscales comes from a similar place as DogginDays. I love the puzzle that the army presents. I love the way that they play, and I love not necessarily the building that you can do with them, but the actual tactical play and even the strategic play is so in depth. It's truly so incredible. Every single game I play, I feel like I learn a new trick with it. It's such a blast. So with that said, let's get into the meat of this discussion. I am excited to compare and contrast these popular king builds. First, we should discuss when is an appropriate time to bring them to a format. What helps you decide when to run the grubs?
With Torkulna specifically, if I expect to be going up against a lot of smaller medium commons, he can be a good answer. If it's a melee-heavy environment, he's going to be a great answer. I don't know if you want to talk about it right here or save it specifically for the Nagrubs discussion, but there are a couple of army types and builds that I think Torkulna will suffer in. And if I expect I'll be going, the tournaments I go to, they're in person and it's usually blind events. So, we don't know what people are going to bring per se. It's just sort of, here are the banned units, or it's maybe heroes only or whatever, and so you just you look at whatever meta you're presented with in a format. And I love Torkulna enough that I'm going to try to find every way that I can fit him into my competitive games. But a lot of times it doesn't feel wise to bring him just for a given format. So I think generally if it's an kind of a broad open format where you can bring anything, he's not a bad option. He is good into a lot of different armies, just from my experience. We can talk about it later. The armies I think he will suffer into. But generally, if I don't know what I'm going into, I oftentimes feel fairly safe playing him, I guess because I played him so often. I know how he works more or less. But I would say melee-heavy armies or melee-heavy metas with a lot of small and medium squad figures, or even heroes, because you can auto-wound with his stomp. But I guess that's something we can get into in the Nagrub section.
And your local scene may vary, your mileage may vary depending on certain players. If your local scene loves to play a lot of range or loves to play a lot of melee, that might be something you just need to figure out in your own local scene as you get to know players, as you play more in your region. Knowing when Greenscales are viable is kind of an interesting question. I know we organized these by squad, and we're going to go through our discussion by squad. I actually think when deciding whether Greenscales are viable, it really comes down to, is the dragon I want to bring viable, not whether Greenscales are viable. Because first of all, if we're talking about regular pricing, in Classic only, Nilfheim is very, very good at low figure counts, whether high point totals or low point totals, very good at low figure counts. High figure counts and low point totals is probably the worst option for him. High figure totals and high point totals are not too bad, because you can start to slide it out of the king build Venn diagram area into slightly more of the you expect this figure to produce the most damage, but if he dies, you have backup options. Mm-hmm. I'm going to frame a decent amount of this discussion with Delta in mind, frankly, because talking about whether stuff is viable in Classic pricing often comes down to, is this a cheese event or not, where anything goes? And if that's the case, then there's really only one classic dragon and one VC dragon that are options. And in that case, Greenscales are almost always viable. But I don't run Greenscales at my locals just because I usually tend to bring something pretty goofy because I host my own. So I typically bring something, below meta just to relax and have fun and not feel too competitive. In terms of that, low figures is probably the best way to run Greenscales with, and really any king builds. Low figures can be a little more useful for them as Squadscape is still dominant for the most part. So I'll make sure to talk about whether my thoughts are influenced by delta pricing or not moving forward here. But that is one other thing that's going to separate our discussion from the COV podcast is delta is an extremely prominent pricing system now. I think it might be over half of all tournaments now are using delta pricing just to have a wide open, constantly evolving, underexplored meta, which is great. I think it's fantastic. Love the delta pricing system. Will always go to bat for it. But that is also something that's going to be coloring this discussion.
I think it's the way to play. Personally, I love delta. And again, the pricing does affect what you can fit into your king armies because a lot of kings go way up in price. And some squads go up in price and a lot of support units go up in price in VC Delta. So it changes what you can build into those armies. But I'm with you, man. Yeah, the VC Delta, it's the way to go.
Absolutely. Let's jump into these king builds. We're going to start with Greenscales because I love to talk and I love to talk about Greenscales. DogginDays, you are absolutely welcome to hop in here. I know you've expressed a lack of experience with these units, and that's totally fine. I think it's great to get differing opinions. There are plenty of people in the competitive community who disagree with me. I will make sure to clearly lay out those opinions as well, hopefully as best I can, and favor both sides. Obviously, I'm partial to my own opinion, but I want to make sure that this podcast has a wide variety of ideas and discussion, because you may disagree and you may find success in an opinion that is not mine. So,
for sure.
With that being said,
selfishly, I've actually just got on this podcast just to learn and take notes. That's actually my main reason for being.
Yeah. He doesn't want to listen to the podcast. He wants to actually be on the podcast and take direct, get it straight from the source.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
Excellent. Yeah, let's hop in. I've got some notes here. I've ranked these from, in my opinion, the best options to the worst options. Those are framed with classic pricing in mind. In Delta, they all sort of mix together a little bit better, although some of them are still more playable than others, unfortunately. But let's start with Quahan, and I'm going to pronounce it like that because I'm extremely white, and that's what I've been saying it as this whole time, and I've
been saying Quahan this whole time.
See, you're right.
Quahan's fine.
Oh, you're correct.
Am I?
Yeah, you're correct. But I'm wrong on that. I'll take the L on that one, but I'm not going to change. I just want people to know.
Yeah, it's kind of like Charos. I've heard his actually the official pronunciation is like Karos, and I just look at that and I'm like, no, it's Charos. I'm sorry, that's what I grew up as a kid.
Yeah, with a rolled Spanish R too, I believe. Karos. I can't roll my R's, but Karos. No, it's gonna be Charos. It's gonna be, and that's fine. I'd recommend. Hexel put out a great video about pronunciations. Highly recommend it. Very entertaining. Not a single agreement. That's the number. We're gonna talk about play styles here and rankings and stuff. That people don't care about that.
It's the
pronunciation that
they're going to get that settled.
Yeah, no one can agree on. I just want everyone to know I know I'm wrong on this, but I'm not gonna stop. So, Quahan, absolutely the best option for the Greenscales, and this is the strongest build in the game, especially if it has filler. And I will stand by that to the day I die. Now, 2024 was the year of the Greenscales. Greenscales, Quahan, Raylin won the EscapeCon 3 V-Cheese event. I also won the OST V-Cheese event with the identical format as it was intended as a V-Cheese practice for EscapeCon with Nilfheim, Greenscales times 2, and Raylin, plus some Mara Warriors and Marku, which already starts to pull away from a king build, and I'll talk about that in just a second here. Why?
I'm sorry. Just to clarify, you won a tournament with Marku, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, very good. I'll let my friend who hates Marku know. Thank you.
Oh, the key there is to make sure your opponent also has Marku in every single game so that he never betrays you.
He never betrays. That is very true.
I don't think, I think there was maybe one game in that whole tournament where I had to activate Marku and actually roll for the Eternal Hatred, because I either didn't have to activate him or my opponent also had Marku, and so he was just a free, incredibly overpowered 20-point figure.
Yeah,
That's
sorry.
No, you're fine. That's the key to playing Marku.
Yeah, I agree.
Just make sure he can't betray you. But that kind of already starts to bleed away a little bit from a king build, and again start to go to that, lean towards that one side of the Venn diagram. And that's why I wanted to distinguish between these different types here, because if Quahan dies, obviously the Greenscales lose a huge buff. All of the main offense goes out the window. However, Marku is still an extremely powerful offensive piece, frankly, and so are the Mara Warriors. So it's right on the border between those two and sort of gets pulled towards the center, I think. But why is Quahan Greenscales the best build in the game? And this will also be controversial because we'll talk about the spiders in a little bit here. And for a long, long time, Spiders Quahan was considered to be the absolute best V-Cheese build in the game. Tier 0, whatever you want to call it. The only, something out of its league. Having played it a couple times myself, several times actually, and watching results, I disagree. Last year in both of those tournaments, Quahan Spiders performed averagely. There are answers to it now. People are just learning how to play against it is the main thing, but people still aren't fantastic at playing against Quahan Greenscales, especially with sort of a new way to play them with Raylin. So the idea behind Quahan Greenscales is to use the Greenscales as a shield, as you would expect. It works a lot better than the spiders because getting them in the double aura buff immediately to 6 defense, 7 with shadow, jungle, or height, or possibly both, adding them up to as much as 8 defense on a single 20-point figure is quite remarkable. There used to be an idea that you needed to play Greenscales at a minimum of 3x, and that's still a very strong opinion. I disagree. I think 3x is very nice. 3x Greenscales is very nice if you can get them. They are not necessary because, again, you are always bringing Raylin with this build. Raylin is probably the best unit in the game. She's very, very, very good. Her being in the army essentially makes Greenscales as invincible as you can make a figure. I mean, imagine Q9 level defense on a 20-point figure running around with 3 fellows in the squad lining up to protect your dragon. It's practically invincible. It's extremely hard to break through. Now, there are some answers in the modern competitive sphere. Heavies can be pretty decent into them because heavies have disengaged and can slip past the screen. Grimnack can chop through those Greenscales. But anecdotally, I beat that army twice with Greenscales Nilfheim, so it's absolutely not a guaranteed win whatsoever, especially depending on the map. Your Raylin placement is extremely important here. You want to move her as little as possible. You also want her to be as safe as possible. I think knowing where Raylan is going to go when you sit down to play this army is the number one thing that separates good Greenscale players from great Greenscale players. It's not actually the Greenscale play, it's the Raylan play. And that can be the same for a lot of things. That's why she's very popular in Reverse the Whip. But the Greenscales acting as a screen is a fairly new idea because, again, 3x Greenscales, you don't necessarily need that many. I had success with 2x. Johnny Frisbee won ScapeCon 3 VGs with 3x with no support, but that's because Quahan is very easy to keep alive. And Quahan, why is Quahan better than Nilfheim? Quahan has a special attack of a ranged attack of 4 skulls at a range of 4. When she chooses a target, she can chain that target and pick a second one using that first target as the line of sight point. So instead of drawing from Quahan, she can draw 3 spaces away, making that next attack have an effective range of 7. And then from there, she can go 2 more spaces and hit a figure even further away. Now it's just 1 roll, so you have that sort of Mimring Molten Claw weakness where you're maybe not as consistent across a round. It's sort of feast or famine. You can blank, or you can roll 3 out of 4 and wipe out all 3 figures. And the main reason that Quahan is so good is because Quahan is so perfect at countering Raylan. Raylan's aura is only 4 range, and it is really, really, really difficult to set up in the aura in a way that Quahan is not able to lightning rod straight to Raylan. And as soon as your Raylan dies in a VCheese game, it's probably over for you, which is just the reality of it. Now, if you're a melee player playing a 10th backed Raylan, you're probably just going to kill the 10th because you're never going to get to Raylan in the first place. But if you have range and you have the option to hit Raylan along with 2 other figures, of course you're going to do that. It effectively eliminates what was once thought to be the very, very strongest cheese army, which is Rats, Q9, and Raylan, because those squeaky little guys just turn into lightning rods straight onto those feathery wings. So, or are they armored? Are they armored wings?
I guess they're armored, yeah.
Are they really feathery? Maybe not.
Yeah. Well, it depends if he paints it, but if you don't mind, another reason I like Quahan over Nilfheim is that Quahan can get engaged and still has all the freedom to attack whoever she wants. With Nilfheim, if he gets engaged, and is trying to go for a figure farther away, he has to deal with the ones he's engaged with first.
Yes.
And I just think that's a really cool element of freedom that Quahan has. Yeah, I just was really impressed by. But that specifically was a realization I had when comparing her to Caligrith, but I'll let you cook on that. We can get to that as we come to it. But no, I just wanted to chime in with that.
That's an excellent point. And we can start to compare and contrast Nilfheim, because Nilfheim is the second best option and the second strongest build in the game, in my opinion, if it has filler as well. Nilfheim has a similar offensive output. You have the potential for 3 attacks of 4 per turn, just like Quahan. However, there's a couple extremely significant differences that make them play very differently. The main thing is that each roll happens separately for Nilfheim, so you're more consistent across a turn compared to Quahan. You're maybe similarly consistent across a round. However, Nilfheim is less likely to maybe go on a huge snowball effect where you roll 3 for 4 9 times in a row, compared to Quahan, where you just need to do it 3 times in a row to hit those 9 figures with all those dice. And similarly, I slightly prefer Nilfheim for the fact that he is a little more consistent, and so he's also less likely to blank 3 times in a row and have a round where he doesn't kill a single figure. Nilfheim is pretty solid in that he's likely to kill at least 1 figure per turn, if not 2. And he's likely to do that every turn as well. The other main difference is he has to target separate figures, just like Quahan, but the range is 5, and he's always targeting from himself every time. So your maximum range there is 5, but the range of each attack is 1 more than Quahan's first attack. So you have a slight range advantage there. And I think in the Dragon pseudo mirror, Quahan versus Nilfheim actually has a slight advantage, being able to, quote, outrange, unquote, Quahan. It's very, very slight. And again, like you said, not having to disengage, being able to hit rail in very easily makes Quahan the better dragon in 90% of the matchups. I will fully admit that. I like playing Nilfheim personally because I like the challenge, first of all. Love the figure. And I do think I trust myself. So for a slightly less experienced player, Quahan, always the option. For a player such as myself that has played basically every top tier matchup you could imagine with Quahan Nilfheim. Sorry, not Quahan and Nilfheim, just Nilfheim Greenscales. Just the two together. They're just having fun. King and Queen. Played every top tier matchup with Nilfheim Greenscales. I trust myself to still be able to squeak out those matchups that Quahan would have made a little easier in order to have a better matchup into the mirror. That was my thinking going into that OST season. I thought I would encounter Quahan Greenscales for sure, or even Quahan Spiders, in which case I would have a pretty significant advantage being able to control, even by 1 space difference, being able to control where the matchup happens.
I was gonna ask you, and this is genuine curiosity. I don't know. I mean, they're both excellent, and I have minimal experience playing them competitively. But do you have a preference on their stat lines? I don't know if that's outside the scope of this podcast, but I was always kind of perplexed by which is better if they got swarmed by a bunch of common figures. You know, Quahan has some extra lives, but 1 less defense. Nilfheim is at 6 lives, but he's got the extra 4 defense. I kind of try to, anytime I'm running a king army, I try to view the king as fragile and, you know, just doesn't matter what their survivability is, just protect them. Just go out of your way to protect them. But I guess I was kind of curious if you thought that stat line difference of theirs had an effect on their matchups and how they do into different metas.
Well, you're correct in that is absolutely the way to play them. They are the most important thing on the board. In terms of a stat line, I prefer the extra defense just because 1 extra life is 1 more wound. But assuming I'm rolling defense dice, 10 to 15 times a game with Nilfheim or more, that's 10 to 15 more defense dice that I've rolled with that extra defense. And that could be all the difference. So I prefer Nilfheim stat line, but I do think they're both. I mean, 7 life and 5 defense in Raylan's aura is still so beefy, just like 6 defense and 6 life is in Raylan's aura for Nilfheim. They are extremely beefy, and that can be a trap if you are like, I got 6 defense, I'm untouchable, and then you lose 2 lives because you blank to one 4th mass roll, and you're like, okay, this game changed real fast. Mm-hmm. And that is so. Keeping your king build is very important, and this is an overarching theme of king builds. But obviously, if the king dies, your game is essentially over. And that separates the other parts of the Venn diagram, where if the king dies, it is not necessarily over in the case of melee bonding or in Rygarn VC. And I think Quahan Nilfheim are best if they're not actually technically a king build. I think the Morrow Warriors are probably the best thing you could do for Nilfheim and Quahan. For 50 points, being able to, first of all, have increased range, have that massive endgame capability, and frankly, early and mid-game capability, depending on what you're doing. I've used them to devastating effect as a round 1 assault force on a melee army, on heavy grudds, actually, that I knew were a fairly hard counter to Nilfheim Greenscales. And having that range, you can abuse a map a lot more easily. They're so fast. And then if you use them in the opening and you lose 1 or 2, well, you have the time, presumably, to run right back into Raylan in your start zone where the Greenscales haven't moved because they don't need to. Why would they into a melee matchup? So I think Quahan and Nilfheim technically operate at their strongest as pseudo king builds. Now, Johnny Frisbee obviously had great success with Quahan Greenscales in VCs, and there was there was an event just recently on June 15th, Sir Heroscape Champions Circle Season 2, Qualifier number 2, which was a VCs event. It was 400 points and 20 figures, and I know I said high figure count, low point is pretty bad for dragons. Greenscale Warriors ×2, Isamu, Quahan, and Raylan the Curie Warrior won the whole event at 5-0. That was my suggestion to that player to play that army. I myself played the same build, but with Nilfheim, and went 3-2, mostly due to my own mistakes. I actually don't blame the build there. I made several crucial mistakes with my Raylan placement, and that decided both of those games. So again, I think this really is the strongest build in the game, especially if it is filler, but it honestly doesn't need it. Quahan Greenscales is the real tier 0 build, especially if you know what you're doing. And the funny thing is, that player was actually not extremely familiar with Quahan Greenscales. They'd seen me play it quite a bit. They had watched, they're a good friend of mine, and they had watched a lot of my play, and of course I've talked them a bunch, and I'm the one that pushed them into playing that build. I told them, I have a screen cap before the tournament. I set them this army, and I said, if someone has the guts to play this, it will win, because again, 9 figures in a 20-figure limit is so gutsy. When you can spam 5x 4th, when you can spam 4x 10th and Raylan, right? Like when you can blast out all of these extremely high figure armies. But it fits. 2x Greenscales fits, and you really don't even need that third squad, because again, the idea is those Greenscales are fortresses. They're invincible. They have 6 defense, 7 defense, 8 defense, ridiculous numbers, and you're never going to touch Quahan with melee because they're screening off, and even range. The idea is that you throw your Raylan far forward. You fling her across the board as far as she can go, and this is what you have to do into the Q9 matchup with Nilfheim as well, because he's not as easily able to hit Raylan as Quahan is. Presumably she survives whatever gets thrown her way, and as soon as Quahan starts blasting away, and when she's on, that's the game. Quahan sits up there with 6 defense on height and just obliterates the army. Greenscales, there is some flexibility in Greenscale play. You can be very, very creative, and I don't know if this player had to be during the Sir Heroscapes tournament, and I'm not sure how Johnny Frisbee play it. You need to be very creative with Greenscales sometimes. I frequently will put them outside of Raylan's aura just to clog up a figure. Taking leaving engagements from a 1 Greenscale as you're trying to like claw your way to the dragon that's absolutely obliterating you is painful. And so you can ram a Greenscale forward and say, yeah, I'm fine to sacrifice you. I will frequently move Greenscales out of Raylan's aura. I will also move my dragon out of Raylan's aura on occasion. It can be an extremely surprising move to your opponent who has thought, wow, this is clearly the spot they're going to set up. I'm going to mobilize my force in a way that I can assault this position in the best way possible, and then bam, you're on the other side of the map. You're getting blindsided, and you have no idea what just happened. And similarly, I have taken multiple disengages in a single turn with Nilfheim. You finally get to Nilfheim. I've taken 2 disengages in a single turn with Nilfheim on rats just to get that third attack. I really think the second you get tied down with Nilfheim, you're out of there. That's the number one mistake new players make, and frankly, I think even old players are susceptible to not taking the double disengage. You cannot have your offensive output reduced for a single moment in a VCs game. Really, any competitive game, you obviously don't want your offensive potential reduced ever. That's a big part of the game. But you're not going to kill both those rats, right? The odds are very low. It's 25%, maybe slightly higher, to get both of those kills and for yourself up for a third attack. That's not the odds you want to take. So you just take the double disengage, you take one wound, and now you have 3 attacks. I think those are some of the most creative ways. And there's more tactics. I have streams. I wish I had more streams of those games. I know on Sir Heroscape's channel, there's a stream of one of our Orcs versus Greenscales and Nagrubs game, and then I did stream the finals as well. That was a really interesting game. I didn't play it perfectly, but what is interesting about that is that my Raylan actually died round 2, turn 1. She was off the board. She was off the board before I put down my first order marker on that second round, and I still managed to win the game, only losing 2 more Greenscales, I believe.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Because just speaking from my Nagrub Torkulna experience, when Raylan goes down, that's usually the end game for me. If she goes down too early, that's usually it.
And it can absolutely be the same way for No 5 Greenscales, depending on how early it is. The interesting thing is, I know I said earlier in VCheese, if your Raylan goes down first, that's probably it for you. That is not the first game that I've won where I think that was even the third or fourth game that I've won where I, again, flung Raylan out as far as she could go. Raylan dies, and in that time my opponent spent killing her, I was able to clear out the front force. And now, sure, I'm facing, a couple squads of 4th Mass or 10th Reg, but I've got all the height and I've got all the freedom now that No 5 does not mind the ability to flash across the board with 6 move flying and screen off with Greenscales who are now just completely expendable. And that's the idea. The Greenscales are intended to be extremely sturdy. At the end of the day, they're expendable. Your king is not. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the biggest takeaway. You need to do everything in your power to keep your king build alive. And that's something I still see No 5 and Quahan players making that mistake is not being willing to make those sacrifice plays, run stuff out of Raylan's aura, run stuff out of the dragon's aura, running the dragon out of Raylan's aura to get out of danger. Like there needs to be even more creative play than you would think with these builds, and that's partly why I love them. I think I've spoken long enough about these two. Hopefully this has cemented in your mind that these are some of the strongest builds in the game. It's really, Squadscape is good because it's just the number of attacks is extremely high. Nothing can match Quahan and Nilfheim's offensive output consistently. It is 3 attacks of 4 per turn, and then assuming you have Greenscales and they are buffed, if they're hitting anything, if it's against melee especially, you have 3 more attacks of 3, possibly 4 if they can get to height, and so you're looking at almost 20 dice or more of attacks per turn. That is insane. There is nothing in the game that gets close to that on a very consistent basis. And so, yeah, just in terms of sheer offensive output, sure, it's a hero, and they're prone to blanking. They're not immune to the odd, I don't know, at Laga, Deadeye Dan, shenanigans in a more casual setting.
Counts.
Yeah, in a more casual setting.
What could you do?
I guess I haven't seen that yet, but I would love to watch Deadeye Dan kill Quahan in a VCheese game one day.
The very first tournament I went to, I played. It was at Classic Points, and I played Torkulna, Nagrubs, Raylan. I think I had Sam Brown as range filler. And I went up against a Nilfheim Greenscales army that had Avlaga in it. Of course, Avlaga went for Torkulna, and I think I nearly had a heart attack. He missed, thank goodness. But that's If I have some inkling that Avlaga might be showing up in a king tournament or in a tournament, I might rethink bringing a king army.
That's funny. Yeah, I mean, in VGs, you never see those figures for good reason, because you could take Mara Warriors and a squad of rats for the same price as that Laga, or Mara Warriors for Deadeye Dan.
Sure.
But the theory behind them is that they're getting just as many high quality attacks as the squad is per turn, 3 attacks of 4, which is crazy. And then of course the Greenscales, I mean, they're not always attacking. And again, if you're playing melee, you're playing very defensively. If you're playing range, they're probably not getting the high quality attacks, because you're still kind of trying to sit at the edge of your opponent's range and pick them off and try and reduce their activations. But you know, if you run 1 or 2 out and you get a couple attacks of 2 or 3 on a nice opportunity, that's a couple more kills. And again, that's like 5 or 6 more dice. You're getting up to 15, 16 dice per turn. What can match that? I mean, a 4th mass weight than fire on height that you set up once a tournament, maybe if you're lucky. I mean, all of these things that have to go.
Amber Hive Protectors. That's Amber Hive Protectors.
That's true. Yeah,
that's 24
without the downside of
we'll get to
I guess without the downside of losing 6 figures in a turn. But yeah,
that is true. That's fair. That's fair.
That's the difference, I suppose. But yeah, it's really just the sheer number of dice you throw both on offense and on defense is pretty much unmatched in VGs. And you know, if there's some format, it's interesting to talk about, because they're in VGs, they're so dominant in classic points. Like this is the way, right? In Delta, it's a little bit different. They're so expensive. So the minimum threshold you need to play just 2x Greenscales, Nilfheim, and Raylin is like 505 points instead of 385, which is crazy. So it's a completely different ball game. But you know, bringing them to like a locals, most tournaments now, if they're using classic pricing, there's some sort of gimmick so that it's not just VGs, right? Like there's a restricted list, or there's a banned list, or there's a common squad, you know, pricing, or it's heroes only, or any number of things to keep it from just being VGs. I think they become a little less viable outside of VGs just because formats tend to limit the best stuff to make a meta more interesting, and they are the best stuff, so they're going to be less viable outside of those types of formats. That is my opinion on Quayon and Nilfheim. I've talked at length about this on stream, but it'll be nice to have a concentrated reference I can just point to and say, oh, actually, if you want to hear about my opinions on Nilfheim and Quayon, skip to this time at the Stratagems episode. But yes, I think this is in modern Heroscape, the things are shifting even within the last couple of years. Like I said, 2024 was the year of the Greenscale, winning a CCL event with 2x Greenscales, Quayon, Raylin was pretty big. The ScapeCon didn't have a V cheese this year. They just had cheese, so no VC was allowed, so no Quayon was allowed. There were a couple Nilfheim Greenscale ×2 Raylin builds, which I did bring, and I lost 2 very close games, so I did not make the top cut. I played Weight and Fire 4 times in a row, which was super fun, and split the difference there, and then won the first game. It, again, very low figure count, very low points, very high figures, which is difficult for them when you can bring, 4x 10th and Raylin, right? Like that's still tough for them when they don't have their filler options to be able to pick away at that range and be able to pick away. So they needed, because the format was reinforcement, so then the top cut got an extra 150 points or something to add to the army. So unfortunately, I never got to play. There was a metric ton of Q9 Rats Raylin builds that I was fully confident I could win and never got to, which is unfortunate. I know there were a couple other Greenscales builds that didn't do that well either, which is fine. The format was really tough for them. And the funny thing is, making top cut, the way the points worked out, the reinforcements were never going to be great for them either. So they were just like, they were 5 points too many for like the ideal addition of like 2 more Greenscales and Mara Warriors, or like 1 Greenscale Mara Warriors. Marku was like so many points short. It was kind of a rough format for them.
Yeah, and I think that going back to that, the point about the Delta repricing and what that does, you know, these are 2 outstanding builds. Delta really reduces what you can, you know, how you can build them, and that's what I found too with Torkold and Nagrubs. And I'll save that for that discussion. But there is sort of like my dream army within classic points that I'm able to easily do, but in Delta, I'm left with there's so many figures I just need to have in that army, and several of them go up in price. And then in Delta, it's like I'm left with pennies to spend on support, and then it makes so many answers to some of these builds a lot stronger. So, but that's why Delta's great. That's why Delta's great.
No, I agree. I don't want to see, you know, Quahan Greenscale in every tournament. I mean, that's absolutely not what I'm advocating for. And Quahan is currently the matched for the highest priced figure in Delta alongside Major Q9 at 260 points, which is a 70-point increase, almost 50%, which is so insane. I mean, it's not a wonder that they're one of the best. Nilfheim is at 240, and I think that's fair. Again, Quahan, even in Delta, if you can get to that threshold, which used to be 505 before Quahan moved up, now it's 525, I think, to even just get the bare minimum.
Did Nilfheim get updated recently? Did he?
I don't think so. I think it was just
these 2. No, you're right. For some reason, I thought I saw him at 260, but
that was Quahan that jumped up. Yep.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and that's totally fair because Quahan is a little bit better than Nilfheim. Yeah, even in Delta, it's if you can get that minimum threshold of 2x Greenscales, Raylan, and Quahan, man, are you still going to dominate? Because all the other best stuff went up too. It's not just Quahan, and there's a certain point where Delta pricing only helps a unit so much. Like Goblin Cutters are pretty good in Delta until they run up against Quahan, and then all of a sudden you regret you know, like zombies, I think either got cheaper or stayed the same, which is still nice since everything else that was good went up. So in a sense, they got a discount by not moving. And they're great until you run up against Quahan, and then you kind of regret bringing zombies. Like there's a certain threshold where units, doesn't matter the point difference. You know, you could take 1,000 Warriors of Ashra into my Quahan 2x Greenscales Raylan build, and I would still win. I would still win against 3,000 Warriors of Ashra. Like there's just a certain threshold that units have to meet in just basic power, regardless of Delta, to be able to beat Quahan. So I think that was a pretty fair increase. Honestly, Nilfheim 2 could probably beat 1,000 Goblin Cutters, but yeah, I think that's. You know,
well,
maybe
the problem that's going to run up against is 1,000 Sahuagin Raiders.
I think
that's
dude, 1,000 Dunes honestly could do it, because they're going to get that paralyzing stare and they're going to crack through.
Oh yeah. I mean, dude could hurt that army. No joke.
Yeah. No, that's why isn't Dune in VGs? That's really.
I don't know. I wonder why he's not in.
Removing those order markers is so brutal. Well, and that's why Spiders had such a draw for so long. Which will be an interesting secondary discussion to this one. But
sure.
I think I've talked so long. I think I'm ready to move on.
No, man.
I'm holding you hostage here with my soapbox.
I'm just a sponge. I'm absorbing this information.
Okay.
So
I'm going to convert. He says he's a Nagrubs player now. I'm going to convert DogginDays. He's going to be playing Greenscales before he knows it.
Could be, although they have a pretty special place in my heart. It's you have an uphill battle.
That's fair. That's fair.
They are outstanding.
We're working away. And I think this will segue. We'll segue into the rest of these dragons, which will be much less to talk about because they're much less relevant in in a VC setting, although they can be much better in Delta events because they're obviously priced way, way cheaper. And even some classic pricing events, we talked about how, these events often have some sort of gimmick like a restricted list or a ban list or anything like that limits the really, really good stuff. And these dragons often aren't on those lists. So they can be, if you want to play Greenscales, they can be an excellent way to do that. Braxis, I think, is the next best dragon with Greenscales. I will add that little asterisk. With Greenscales specifically, Braxis, I think, is the next best dragon. Braxis is very good. However, Braxis needs a meta read. And what that means is you are not only building your own army, but you're predicting what a typical army will look like in the tournament you're going to go to. And you have identified that Braxis will not run into her very, very bad matchups, which are larger, huge squads. Yeah. First of all, is the big one. And then, any larger, huge figure really is very painful for her. Running up against another dragon, running up against Torkolna could be pretty painful.
Marten Hounds.
Marten Hounds, Templar Cavalry in classic pricing, probably won't see them. Deathstalkers, though, I think honestly are pretty decent in certain formats. Even range, even if you expect to see 10th or 4th, even Ashigaru, I have seen beat Braxis without Raylin. Again, in classic pricing, if you're going to take a dragon, you might as well take Quehan Nilfheim because Braxis's good matchups are very good. Obviously, being able to Acid Breath Warforged or things that are maybe a little sturdier. Nosker Cultist, very expensive. Minions,
Sentinels?
Yeah, minions can hold up. Sentinels can hold up. Lots of good defensive abilities there. Being able to just burn through those is very, very good. However, as we mentioned, her bad matchups are very, very bad. And you run up against Marten Hounds and it's just over for you. So from that sense, you need to have some level of predicting the meta here. And I'm actually hoping to do another Stratagems discussion on army building and meta reads and what that means. But Braxis, super solid. Again, it's not 3 attacks, it's 3 rolls with the D20 and 8 or higher, and you can kill a squad figure. A 16 or higher, and you can kill a hero, which is very good. Oh, yes, Wormlings aren't fantastic for her, not that they're super strong. And then Kurok is obviously very good. Heroes only, that type of stuff. Not that you can't see Kurok outside of that, but Kurok with all of his heroes is pretty devastating for Braxis. Fire Elementals are terrible for Greenscales because anything that can bypass that 6 defense that you expect with Raylin hurts a lot. And I was just going to add in VC, Zundar is a pretty similar thing with the shadows. And there are a couple other common hero builds like Nottingham Brigands or Hoplotrons that also, and Hoplotrons are large and huge too, but they're heroes, which is just so much tougher to get the roll that you need to eliminate them.
Do you have Kurok as one of your king queen armies?
If the figure dies, the potential for damage is reduced, but they're not the ones doing the damage.
Okay, yeah. No, that makes sense because if you're doing Firestorm, all your damage is coming from your fire elementals.
Exactly. You just need to dust the definition. Like, people can have different definitions of king builds. That's totally fine. I was just trying to rigorously define one. In my mind, I think of Kurok as a commander build.
Okay,
similar
that's
to
fine.
Kentono Daichi. Yeah. But I could totally see an argument where you just say, no, that's a king build. I think that's fair.
That makes sense.
This also helps cut down, limit our discussion. It was already very long. We talked for
fair enough.
I've talked for an hour and we've got through 3 dragons, but I'll go quicker. I promise. I'll go quicker.
It's all good.
So just to wrap up Braxis, very, very good into things with defensive abilities, smaller, medium squads. Pretty bad into a lot of other stuff. Even range squad figures. So, but a lot of advantages over the rest of the dragons that we're going to talk about. And frankly, some of these dragons might rise or fall in positioning here. This is not a static list, and I don't intend it to be. I rank them in my mind right now, what is best to worst, but I'm not even sold on my own rankings, and my opinions might change over time as they have in the past, and hopefully will frequently in the future, because that's how you can continue to evolve as a competitive player. So next up, we're just going to have Zelrig. Zelrig is honestly pretty close to Molten Claw. Like, I've got Molten Claw a little lower on the list, but it's tough. They, again, drawbacks and benefits to both. So Zelrig is pretty map dependent, in my opinion. If you can Z-bomb turn 1, which is where you rush up on your first order marker and can hit the start zone with your ranged attack of 7, that is the that's the cream of the crop for Zelrig maps. That's beautiful when you can happen. Now, I will say any opponent worth their salt is just going to avoid that regardless, so I don't think it's as potent as it used to be. Zelrig is actually, unlike the other dragons, is extremely good in high figure limits, though, because that means it's a lot more difficult to keep your packed start zone spread apart. If you've got 18 figures in a 24-figure start zone, you're taking some risks there. Yeah.
Yeah, and one army that hates Zelrig are hive armies, like a hive with a bunch of drones. You just shoot the hive.
Yep.
You could roast everything around it.
Yes. Romans hate Zelrig. Anything that wants adjacency bonuses hates Zelrig. He's got a lot of tools. The ranged special having a ranged special is one of the strongest toolkits in the game. That's what makes dragons so good. Being a special attack bypasses a lot of defensive abilities, and being a ranged attack bypasses a lot of defensive abilities. So he's got higher damage potential but lower actual potential. And what that means is that, again, that Z-bomb is like the ideal for any Zelrig player, but it's never going to actually happen. And as soon as the game starts, all of that dissipates once your opponent is able to spread out their figures. He's getting 1 attack of 3 per turn. That's actually pretty bad offensive output. Now, that attack of 3 is pretty effective because you're reducing defense down to, 2 or 1 or even less. So it's still a pretty effective attack of 3, but it's also pretty easy to roll. 1 skull, 0 skulls, nothing spectacular. The benefit to that is that it does force awkward positioning, and I think this is something that isn't talked about enough. The sort of passive effect of threat figures with AoE attacks, like some of the Cowboys, Deathwalker, Zelrig, anything that can bomb figures can make it really awkward. That threat is there. I think Zelrig actually doesn't need Raylan like these other dragons, because you're not playing him the same. You're not trying to sit back with your ranged figure and protect that ranged figure and shoot out your attacks from a distance, because shooting out 1 attack of 3 from a distance is really not that good. Now, I will admit, I have never seen a legitimate attempt to play Zelrig as like a major Q9 build where you sit back behind your Greenscale wall and shoot from 7 range. That is an interesting concept. I don't know if it would work, but again, Zelrig has 4 defense, so 6 with Raylan. The Greenscales would also have 6. Once, again, 1 attack of 3 is not very good, but if you're playing a melee army, those figures can spread out. That's fine. You're still getting 1 attack of 3. Once they engage, the Greenscales will be able to, quadruple your attacks with 3 more attacks of 3. The funny thing is about that, once they become engaged, Zelrig is so majestic that he does not differentiate your figures from your opponent's figures. So if you want to target a figure that's engaged to one of your own, well, you are probably also sacrificing that Greenscale. However, if they were in Raylan's aura, you'd only drop them down to 4 defense. And
That's
so,
true. That's interesting. Yeah.
if you've got a squad of knights that have rushed in, you can hit one, maybe two of them if they didn't, if they were kind of forced into that positioning, and they've got 2 defense, but your Greenscale has 4. And so that Greenscale is maybe surviving that attack. And maybe even if it doesn't, if you manage to get 2 knights out of the way, maybe that's worth it. So
that's really interesting.
I think it's a possibility. I really think it is. In Delta 2, Zelrig is a lot cheaper. I do think playing Zelrig like that would still benefit from a lower figure count, because he's not necessarily going to try and do that Z-bomb, dash around the map, hit things and that sort of way. But yeah, playing Zelrig as a king build is a little riskier. He's just not a very good mid-game and end-game figure. Well, that's not true. He's not a very good mid-game figure. He can be a decent end-game figure. The problem is, if he's your main game figure, there's not going to be an end game because you've already lost. And that's the unfortunate reality of Zelrig. Molten Claw actually does a lot better with Raylin. That ranged attack of 4 and then the fire line out of 4, the discounted fire line, absolutely has a place with Raylin and low Greenscale counts in certain formats. It is so difficult to play around. Oh my God. It like, first of all, the amount of brain power you need to avoid that fire line is a penalty in itself. Like, truly the value you might get out of your opponent on your 3rd round in a tournament that has already played 2 difficult games. I know I lost to Greenscale's Molten Claw in the last OST Season 8 finals, I believe, simply because I simply made mistakes. I was doing my absolute best to avoid the fire line and still overlooked some positionings that Molten Claw could get to and get off multiple attacks. And there were simply mistakes that were absolutely avoidable, and I didn't avoid them just because it was so difficult.
It's hard. It's very hard.
Yeah. And I think Molten Claw with 6 life and only 3 defense really benefits from Raylin. Again, because the difference here is that Zelrig only gets multiple attacks if your opponent lets you. Nilfheim and Quayon are almost guaranteed to get all of their attacks off. Molten Claw, if Molten Claw is not getting all of your attacks off, that means your opponent has spread themselves so weird that they're probably also not getting their own full attacks off. Like, Zelrig, you can just be 2 spaces apart and be fine, but Molten Claw, you gotta do all this crazy stuff, and
it's really difficult. And if you are putting in that brain power to space out your figures exactly such that he can't, attack multiple, you are probably not developing very optimally, across the board. So that in itself, even if you play impeccably and prevent Molten Claw from hitting 2 figures, in his attack, your development is really bizarre at that point. And it's just that in itself is useful, and that's the threat it's just something he provides. So he's
and again, Molten Claw benefits a lot from Raylin for that reason. He can actually sit back and hit multiple targets. You are perfectly allowed to bounce a fire line off one of your own Greenscales if they're in position to hit something. There's nothing stopping you from making your Greenscale the focal point of that lava, blasting through there. And with 6 defense, again, your Greenscale is a lot more likely to survive. So you have an opportunity to hit a figure that could be 8 spaces away from Molten Claw, who's sitting 4 spaces away from a Greenscale in the center there. That's incredible. That is incredible range. So Raylin is absolutely a useful tool here. Also, discounted figure in Delta and still cheaper than Nilfheim and Quayon in regular pricing, and well, all of these dragons as well. Molten Claw is only 170 in regular pricing.
Yeah. I think there's something to be said too about any figure. These are very rare, but those single space huge figures, you have a lot of ability to place them wherever you want on a map. You just need a single space. Whereas with, Nilfheim, especially with his wings and Quan, like sometimes it can be a little tricky to find a good 2-space spot for them to camp, or to come up on. But I like Exensia from VC. She's a huge single space figure, and she has flying, and I love that flexibility that you only need to find one good space to plop them on. And sometimes that can be like a 1-hex perch. You don't have to find a 2-hex perch. And there is something to be said about that, I think.
That's an excellent point. Yeah, and on a similar vein, not having to roll for lava damage doesn't necessarily come into play a lot, but it could. It absolutely could. If there's, a lot of lava maps, typical competitive maps these days have lava as high ground. They tend to play very dynamic. They're extremely interesting maps. That's where you want to set your dragon up on is some sort of controlled high ground area, right? Just to get all of those benefits. But if you're taking the potential of 1 lava damage every turn or having to reposition somewhere a little more awkward to avoid it, could be pretty punishing. Molten Claw does not have to worry about that. And it's way less common now to have useful molten lava spaces, but it is funny. Like the option is there. Just chill in the hot bath, the steam springs for him, I suppose. A nice little hot springs. That's another useful little toolkit in his build. And then with Braylon, very important to get him to that extra defense, I think, more than the other dragons. 6 life, 3 defense is not fantastic. But yeah, I think Molten Claw very close to Zelrig in my mind. Honestly, might even be slightly higher. It truly depends on the format. And again, because Molten Claw is so much cheaper, if you want to transition Molten Claw away from a pure king build into something that has a backup tool, like maybe something that has a Sergeant Drake to deal with Exiles or Krav or something, there might be, the point limit might work out where it doesn't quite fit with Zelrig or even Nilfheim or Braxis, but Molten Claw is just low enough in points that you can fit that support, that secondary piece in there to make that build work. So that's the other advantage of Molten Claw. He is significantly cheaper. I mean, 170, that's 15 points lower than Nilfheim, 20 points lower than Quayon. That could be all the difference, truly. That could be all the difference between being able to make it fit in the build and not. So Molten Claw, an excellent Greenscales pick. And now we're going to start to get to dragons that, again, the caveat, not great with Greenscales, but not necessarily not good dragons. And we'll talk about what we mean with that. Mimring, first of all, not great with Greenscales. In order to use the fire line, you just got to draw a straight line. You can't shoot over your figures like all of the other dragons. And so even with Raylin, hiding behind your Greenscale wall doesn't feel great to just continually blast them with attacks of 4 per turn. If it's a good attack, you're still likely to kill with 6 defense. And 8 range is fantastic, but Greenscale's Raylin is just not, it's just not the move with her. Just Greenscales might work out okay, but then it's hard to utilize that 8 range, especially when, again, the Greenscales want that adjacency bonus. The Greenscales play differently than lots of other squads where they really want to be close to the dragon, and that dragon is constantly shooting fire out of her ass. So it's just not, it's not a safe place to be, is next to Mimring. It's really not. Actually, Mimring is a he.
I was going to say,
I'm mistaken
you, but I thought I read that.
I did. What is he?
You're not the only person who's described as a she.
Again, I'm perfectly happy to admit I'm wrong. I want people to know I'm wrong, and I'm just not going to change. I'm going to.
But you're right. It's like the pronunciation thing, you know.
Yeah.
It's what you know. If you've been using it for that long in your in-house games, that's just how it be.
in the interest of keeping this discussion under 5 hours, I'll continue. I think that's all I have to say about mirroring with Greenscales. We'll have more to say about mirroring in the future. Othcrick, not great at all. Again, similar to Zelrig, he's only going to get multiple attacks off if your opponent lets you. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. And even in Delta, not played at all simply because the offensive potential is so low. Range special is okay, can kind of force awkward positioning as well to some extent, but isn't going to play well with Raylan because the range on the acid spray is very low and it doesn't extend out pretty far like Mimring. That's the big difference there, is Molten Claw technically has an effective range of 8, and Othcrick, it's just 4 plus maybe 1 for any adjacency bonus. And Fragile, 5 life, 3 defense, even with Raylan, that's not good. And his terrain bonus is so situational that even if you get that lurking ambush, 1 attack of 7, like, great. Every other dragon can just kind of do that normally, or get pretty close, and then they have the survivability to actually make that matter, and Othcrick does not. So
I think he's a cool unit, but I would not want to run him with Greenscales. I think there's other builds he can fit into better, or that make more use of him. But
yes.
Yeah, and that's something we can touch upon too. The Greenscales versus Nagrubs. Greenscales have to pick a single dragon, if I'm not mistaken. They can only pick one dragon to be their king, and that is the only dragon they can bond with. Whereas like Nagrubs, I mean, if the Greenscales could bond with Othcrick and a cheat dragon, maybe Oscar can Molten Claw and a bunch of Greenscales, that'd be different. But yeah, I don't think it makes sense to be
there could be some formats like a draft or bring 2. He's got kind of an interesting little toolkit at a slightly lower power level. Reverse the Whip might be an interesting format to play him in.
That's true. That's true. Yeah.
But just a blind bring 1, not great with Greenscales, not great at all, even in Delta, unfortunately. He's kind of like the opposite of what I said. Like, there's just a certain power threshold you need to like still be competitive even in Delta, and he just doesn't quite reach that at the current level at his current price. In a similar vein, I'll go to Brimstone here. Don't even bother with Greenscales on this one. I don't think I know. Yeah, Brimstone with Greenscale, you're just gonna cook them. They're they're waiting to be microwaved. It's not. It's technically this is a build that could exist, but I can't.
I've played it and it's not good.
Yeah, I can't think of a single event that this would actually be useful in. Doesn't benefit from. Their abilities are literally at odds with each other because Brimstone's AoE goes off on everything within 2 spaces, and Greenscales desperately want to be within 2 spaces.
That's very
so true. They're literally, it's like that meme of the guy with the rod on the bicycle, and then he sticks it through his own tires and falls off the bicycle. Yep. And he's like, why did this happen? Like, you're literally just ramming a rod through your bike tire if you play this. Don't do it. Brimstone is a cool unit and actually got a recent Delta price drop, I believe. So there might be some interesting uses for Brimstone out there. In regular pricing, absolutely not. You'll never see him again unless it's like a reverse whip or bring 2 type thing. But yeah, don't bother with Greenscales because their main benefit of being near their dragon is also like their number one problem with Brimstone. And also Brimstone's actual offensive output and survivability is not great. So wouldn't recommend it with Greenscales. Actually, and in a similar vein, although for a different reason, Caligrith, first of all, don't bother with Raylan. Because she's gonna be left in the dust. Yeah. She's gonna be left in the dust. There's no time. Like, Caligrith is speed. She's Lightning McQueen. My favorite Caligrith build has nothing to do with Greenscales, actually. First of all, because it can be kind of tricky. So the walking and flying rules make it a little easier for her to avoid burning her own Greenscales, but not a certainty. It can be difficult to, because it's every figure you flew over per turn. You can't choose, similar to similar to Mimring. You're burning what you're burning. So that can be difficult, first of all. But my favorite Caligrith build is actually it's actually Swiftbangs and it can be any Vark squad. Gray Spears are probably the best one with Manauvi, which is a VC Arcana that gives +2 movement, and then Eldgrim. Eldgrim is filler, and I don't know, maybe Frost Claws to bond with Eldgrim.
To 11 move, right?
Yep.
Yep.
So I'm a big fan of like super boosted Caligrith. I think first of all, like Gray Spear's Manauvi is kind of a decent, like especially in, I think they're about the same price in Delta and Classic. And Delta, everything's a little more balanced, so it makes more sense. But they're kind of a decent 200-point plug and play. Manauvi kind of hits pretty hard. Once they're gone, Caligrith at like double-digit movement is extremely oppressive. You're across the map in one turn, and you're hitting your opponent's start zone the next turn. I mean, so much fun to play. Greenscales are also going to get left in the dust, frankly. She doesn't play anything like, the typical like ranged screen, sit back in Raylan's aura. Like she wants to get out there. The fact that it's everything you fly over. She has 7 move, which is very fast. But even, rushing out and rushing back to the same spot you were in Raylan's aura, that's still an effective range of 4 in a sense. So it's very slow. She does not want to end in the same place she starts. And so Raylan is effectively not useful at all for her. And with Greenscales, it can be tricky not to burn them. I've seen it used to like a decent, to be decently effective. It's honestly not a terrible build. I just like the wacky Caligrith personally, but I can certainly see Greenscales Caligrith becoming a little more relevant in like side events in Classic points or in Delta being interesting.
Yeah, I remember the first time I faced Caligrith, I looked at the card. I had never even seen the figure before because I think it was just released in VC. And I compared her in my mind to like Nilfheim or Quahan just based on stats. And I thought, how is this even fair? Like she's got 1 extra life. Like she's fast. Like how does this? And then it's just, you realize her special attack is, I feel like that special attack can put her in danger a lot of times. It's like, it's very, if you want to use it, if you want her to be mobile, it's very easy for you to like swarm her with figures. And then if she wants to get off her Burning Breath, she has to disengage from all of them. So yeah, I've definitely come to realize that yes, Quahan is better than Caligrith, even if Caligrith stats are better.
Yeah.
But no, that 11 move play is nuts.
It's so much fun. Well, and the same weakness as some of these other dragons where you can line up that, that 6-figure attack and then you roll a 1 out of 4, right? Because it's just 1 attack, which is very swingy. Just does not have the consistency of some of the other dragons. So a really cool VC design plays a lot differently than any of the other dragons. Not well suited to a king build, but has to be mentioned because she is technically an option. And speaking of technically options, let's talk about Zenithrax. Zenithrax of Vineweaver. Now, this has become a bit of a meme, but there was some pushback on my early opinion about Zenithrax being a very bad dragon. Bad as in like not good, not like bad as in like cool, like rad. Just to be clear, like a bad boy, bad as in not playable. And my reasons were a tier list I created on the Avalon Hill released Age of Annihilation designs. I actually played games both against other people and against myself to essentially like play test these units. Not that any feedback was coming out of them other than how good were these units. This was after the campaign had been shut down. This was a couple months after that I decided I want to do this and release the tier list. frankly, not to toot my own horn, but it was more accurate than anything that has come out since for those units, simply because I actually played with them. Unfortunately, all of the modern Age of Annihilation rankings are just theory crafting at this point. I mean, it's just looking at the cards, and I'm throwing shade at Doggin Days here too. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
It's true. Sometimes you just the unit comes out and you just gotta you think you understand a unit just by reading the card, and it's almost never been the case for me. Like sometimes you can get a good read of a unit just reading the card, but a lot of times you just need to play it, and then it can completely change your opinion on it, for better or worse.
Yes. Yeah. And I think it's totally fine. I think it's actually very healthy to have like these early discussions. I'm totally fine doing that. I think ranking them without having ever seen them on the board can be a little bit silly. For example, I was the only one to rank the Frost Claws in the A tier. And then they went and dominated Gen Con. They went and dominated some Escape Con and Sanity of Battle. They were runners up in OHS 57 or 58, whichever was the first one they were allowed in. And then suddenly all of the rankings adjusted them back up a little bit. And similar to Zenithrax, I was the only one that had Zenithrax in like the B- ranking, I think. I had Zenithrax the lowest, the lowest out of any of them, and of course the second Zenithrax hit the tables, people realized, oh, actually this is a very poor dragon, because Zenithrax is a dragon, much like Brimstone and Othcrick, does not mean Zenithrax is a good dragon. But people just saw the card and saw how big the figure was and assumed something has to be going on. I mean, this thing takes up 30 hexes; it's got to be good. Which is
I will say I don't have a dog or doggin. You take your pick. I don't have a dog in this fight, just because I actually don't at the time this video has my Age of Annihilation stuff. I didn't buy it when it first came out. I have an order coming hopefully next week. But I have not played with or against Zenithrax, and I was of the opinion that she was good, but not like, I guess, bad. I didn't think she was fine. But so I'm here just to listen to your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's and it's only funny because I got so much flack for it, only to eventually be proven right. So I'm a little bit smug about that. Is I guess what why I'm bringing it up.
You don't think there's any utility to the glyph placement thing? That struck me as kind of useful.
No, it's really fun. Zenithrax being 200 points.
It's a lot, yeah.
Is so many for, again, what is effectively one attack of 4 per turn. Has the exact same problem as Zelrig. As soon as you go to adjacency dependent abilities, you're only getting multiple attacks off if your opponent is letting you. Zenithrax made 1 appearance at ScapeCon, which was during the team tournament, and didn't show up in a single other event, especially because Zenithrax had not been adjusted in Delta yet. Zenithrax dropped down 20 points in Delta, which is a pretty serious indictment considering the very good dragons have jumped up, 50, 70 points. The decent dragons have all stayed the same or gone up a couple points, 5, 10 points. And then like if you're getting a discount, you're at the level of like Brimstone and Othcrick. Like that's tough for you. That's pretty tough for you. So the Zenithrax works best with Greenscale. I mean, that's the only army Zenithrax works with, is the thing, is obviously only best with Greenscales. There's no other like quirky build, like doesn't really slot into anything as filler, like maybe Nilfheim or Charos would. But yeah, 1 attack of 4 per turn is not very good. The Vine is extremely easy to get around. Looks complicated on paper. It's really not. Huge figures can just stomp right over it, as can large, I believe, and just remove it from the board.
Zenithrax has 6 attack, right? For her normal attack?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
I thought I heard.
And that actually leads into my main opinion on Zenithrax is that you should play Zenithrax as a melee figure. It is not a sit and shoot build. You've got, what is it, 8 lives, only 3 defense, but 8 lives, and you can still kind of screen off some stuff with Greenscales if you're aggressive with them mid game. If you try and draw out any range and let your Greenscales develop in the early part of the game and maybe kind of stall with the vines. But that's all the vines are. They're just stalling. There's even ways for small and medium figures to mitigate them. First of all, they stop your movement because they're a glyph, but they don't kill you. They only kill you if you step off of them. So you can still hop on something and swing your axe or, sword or whatever you got. And then if something is on it at the end of a round, it just goes away. And I think that's a huge problem for Xenothrax, because if you won the initiative for that round and you pop out a glyph, your opponent can just sit on it and it's gone. Again, it slowed him down for a little bit, but you're only doing that once per round. And modern competitive maps, because of things like rats, don't have abusable choke points that you can put glyphs on to effectively screen. And not only that, your Greenscales are also affected by this vine. The vine, again, Xenothrax does not differentiate who she's crushing with those tendrils. Your Greenscales are not going to be able to get around it either. So if you're facing a ranged army, it's just over for you. It's not even close. In the first OHS season where Xenothrax was allowed, none of them made the top cut. There were 3 armies that had Xenothrax, Greenscales, and I'm trying to remember if they had filler. I don't think they had Raylan. I think it was just like Xenothrax, Greenscales times 3 or something. It was a lower figure, a lower point count. And they just, none of them made the top cut, even though there were some very good players playing them. Vegetarian 18, who won EscapeCon World Championships here, didn't make the top cut with Xenothrax, which is pretty damning evidence to me. I think in total they won only like 3 or 4 games in total. One of them was against each other, like the 2 armies played each other, so that win obviously doesn't matter there, and the loss doesn't matter there either. And then one of them was a bye, so just they lost the first round and then received a bye, and I think that was one of Veggie's 2 wins. So it just a poor dragon, and that's not Xenothrax's fault. The designers were trying not to replicate Quahan. They didn't want to make a meta-defining dragon. It's so much easier to buff something after the fact than to tune it down.
Yeah, I was gonna say, if a lot of I feel like the big dragons of Heroscape, they have like a wormling counterpart, and so during Heroscape's drought, when there was the blue wormling for Aquila, but she didn't have a big dragon, so VC's like, oh cool, let's give her a big blue dragon. Perfect, that's her big dragon counterpart. And then I can imagine Age of Annihilation, when it comes out, it's like, oh well, we don't really want to step on VC's toes, we're gonna just make a totally new dragon that has nothing to do with wormlings, or that isn't reminiscent of them in any way. I'll have to see. Yeah, I haven't played with or against her. I'll be interested in trying her out, but I can kind of get that vibe that just not quite up to stuff.
Yeah, one attack of 4 from range is just not quite enough. Even into melee. Greenscales aren't without Raylin, and I think Raylin with if you're playing Raylin with Xenothrax, why wouldn't you be playing anything else with Raylin and Greenscales? Just get those extra 20 points back and triple your offensive output. But yeah, I really think Xenothrax works best as a melee figure. I frankly do. And the funny thing is, in the Age of Annihilation meta only, Xenothrax is okay. It's a lot more, way less squads, obviously unique squads if there are squads. An attack of 8 life, 3 defense, a ranged attack of 4. It's really not too bad, actually. Xenothrax is okay. Okay in the AoE meta.
I was just going to say, AOA only is an interesting format for her. Also, master sets only at like Delta pricing. That could be a use for her because just she has an incredible stat line among that.
Yes, true.
So that may be. I went to a as I shared with you, I went to a master set only tournament, and no one brought Xenothrax, but I mean, she could have had some tools.
Yeah,
the units that show up there. So that might be another niche she has in the game.
Yeah, flying helps her get to places she wants to hit with that 6 attack. Obviously, the big downside, as people are discovering, Xenothrax doesn't fit anywhere. That's like a legit. Like we talked about, Molten Club having a huge benefit of being a single space large figure, which is a legitimate use of that figure that would happen more often than you think. On the flip side, there is a penalty to not being able to move where you want to move.
Absolutely. And that can even come up with Nilfheim.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, and even Quaihan, like they can fit in awkward places, and that's like a necessary downside to those figures. Like it is a penalty that hurts what they're able to do, and it can affect things more than you think. But Xenothrax, more than any other figure in the game, is just unable to actually fit. And like, if you're at a local, like I'm the type of player to like, it fit, like it's close enough. Like I'm not gonna like rules lawyer you like, oh, this, Xenothrax is 0.5 degrees off that hex because this tail is pushing. Like I'm not,
that's like
no one's
stinger denial. If you read stinger denials, it's like, nah, I'm not doing that.
Yes. Yeah, that's an excellent comparison. Yeah, stinger denial is one of those things that's infamous in the community because it maybe happened once or twice and word got around, but no one ever does that. Like this community is so great. No one.
It really is. I remember the second tournament I went to, or no, it was the first tournament I went to because I had Torkulna, and I remember the guy I was playing. Torkulna could like kind of fit. It was a bit of a tough call, I admit, but he was able to fit on the 2 hexes, and his arm was kind of like hanging over a ruin, and that was really the one decider. And I asked my opponent, like, are you cool with this placement? He's like, honestly, like if it was real life, Torkulna would just move his hand. It's fine. So
that's a great point. That's funny.
Yeah, it's just, I don't.
Yeah.
If you're gonna be, I don't know, anal about that, then I don't know if I want to play, honestly.
Yes. No, and that's, the community is very self-regulating on that front. Unfortunately, Xenothrax, like, to the point where like it's not even like you just can't put her places or the map is coming down. Like that's the level that Xenothrax is at with those tails.
Yeah.
Super cool sculpt. This is the most badass sculpts in the game.
I don't think there are any issues with the sculpts of Age of Annihilation. They're so cool.
They are super cool, except as soon as you try and put her on a castle map, and then those pillars are coming down. So that's another downside to Xenothrax. If you want to hit like a Krav that's like on a hill and you're just not, like there's some road in the way, just a little tough there. But yeah, in uniques only does okay. Heroes only honestly might be an interesting pick, just for that potential. Like Kurok, Sundar, very good. Hopotron's very good. 6 attack, 8 life, decent assassination potential. To deal with that, and then just a solid stat line. But as soon as you get to classic and or VC stuff, just completely outclass. I mean, you third your offensive output of Nilfheim and Quaihan and or Braxis to an extent. Even Mimring and Moltenclaw have way higher potential and are a lot harder to get around. And you're paying 20 more points for it in classic pricing. It's just never going to be worth it. So that's the unfortunate reality of Xenothrax. But you're okay to love the dragon. The dragon can be bad and still be fun to play with. There's nothing stopping you. I don't know why. I really don't know why that was such a controversial opinion. Like the dragon can be bad and you can still have fun with it. That doesn't, my opinion of this dragon shouldn't change your enjoyment of it. But Yeah, unfortunately, just not going to be competitive, and that's okay. I wonder if we'll see another dragon at some point, just because it's such a big draw, like.
Or maybe another squad unit that gets introduced that may, boost Xenothrax, or like a bonding unit.
Yeah.
So like maybe Xenothrax is right. Something Dryan, right? Yeah. Like maybe Xenothrax is whatever now, but all it takes is one unit, and suddenly they get transformed. It's like I think of that with the Deathwalkers and like Death Commander or the Zedian Infantry. Like suddenly they're not bad. Like with Zedian Infantry. So all it takes is one unit.
Yeah, something that affects, like, what is Xenothrax, like a wizard or something? I don't. No, it's not a wizard. It's
yeah, she is a warden. Interestingly enough,
warden. Oh,
yeah.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, very cool. I don't know, something that helps wardens, or something that specifically works with Xenothrax.
Let's go. We haven't Warden 816.
We haven't. I don't know if we've seen too many, like, you can specifically like benefit this unit in name. That's kind of an interesting design space that isn't explored a lot.
Well, Iskra and the Wretchets, like
like something like that, like something like that pairs together really well. That'd be cool. Xenothrax and her little buddy or squad figures. That would be very cool. But as of right now, and for the long foreseeable future, there's no word of any sort of design to boost. I think Renegade doesn't seem too interested in making more figures synergistic, specifically with AOA, because the Avalon Hill team did such a good job designing the Avalon Hill designs to work well with Classicscape. So all of that cool synergy already exists. Right. So, like move on to other stuff that hopefully also synergize with Classicscape. But yeah, those are my thoughts on Xenothrax, and very very relevant and topical. Last one of the dragons, and then I will finally stop talking and you can hear that sweet sultry voice of DogginDays again. is Charos, or Karos if you're cultured. Honestly, another meta pick. You need to have a pretty good idea that you're not going to see a lot of range in the tournament you're going to. That is the key. That is the key for this dragon here. Also doesn't need Raylan. Plays better with just much better to have an extra squad of Greenscales for Charos specifically, because you're playing that as like full melee bonding. Just barely a king build, honestly, and only a king build in the sense that the fact that you still expect Charos to do most of the attacking, like most of the high damage per game. Like Greenscales should be getting consistent attacks, but they're not necessarily the highest quality. You may need to spread them out a little bit to play a little bit more defensively to keep Charos safe. I also think this army, the best version of it, slides away from a king build by demanding a ranged component, either Krav. Savarius is cool in General Wars. Something Exiles could be great in AOA. Something to help them with that ranged matchup, because I played against Charos Greenscales in the last Sir Heroscape's Champion Circle League Season 2 Qualifier 4, and it was a slaughter. I played with Ashigaru, the Rifleman, the Spearman, Kato Katsuro, and Raylan. And
that's a brave man.
No, not Hadamoto. Like which one? I'm trying to keep them out. Their names sound so similar. Hadamoto, Kato. It's like the same word right there. Kato Katsuro. Yeah.
Yeah. It's not coming to me either. Yeah.
And it was, well, first of all, the amount of attacks you get and that are
Kamenama?
No, sorry, Kato Katsuro, the one that commands both Ashikaru.
Yes, that's Kato. That's Kato, yeah.
Yes.
Or Kato, or whatever, yeah.
Kato. Oh boy.
Gotcha.
Well, all right. I'm saying Kato because again, I'm super white.
That's fine.
We're gonna pronounce it Kato.
Guri Oni. Like I know it's supposed to be like Gure Oni, but no, we call him Guri. It's just Guri.
Oh,
That's
yeah.
how he is.
Guri
That's how it be.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the best I got. And I know I'm wrong. And again, that's fine. I'm just not going to stop.
It's just Doggers.
That's all it comes down to. But that was an absolute slaughter because I could just screen with Yari and pick off Greenscales as they approach. And one attack of 5 into an 8-point figure feels really bad. Like he was killing Yari at an incredibly consistent rate. And I don't care. Like, you can kill Yari all day. They were like jumping into his mouth practically. And it doesn't matter because I was getting so many weight them fires off. I was getting in circles onto Charles. He's so weak to specials. That is not like into range. He just gets devastated. And the Greenscales have a tough time keeping up into range too with only being a squad of 3, a base defense of 3. Which is still average stats. Obviously, when they're close to Charles, they get 4, which is okay, but it's not invincible. And I think I only lost a handful of Yari before Charles went down, and then it was easy cleanup for the Greenscales. That Charles needs to be another meta read. I think even harder than Braxis. And Charles is not weak to the same things that Braxis is. It's a very different meta that you want to play Charles in. If you can bring a range component, that obviously helps smooth up your matchups, and so then I think it matters a lot less. But if if it's like a melee only event or something, or if it's some sort of like really high point low figure limit, like it's like 500 points, 10 figures, Charles would be excellent in there. If you expect to see a lot of like low attack squad figures, like spammed squad figures.
Oh, no doubt.
Melee squad figures. Charles is also brutal because, again, part of a king build is you're expecting him to deal the most damage. He is the only one of the dragons to do it passively with his counter strike, which is super cool. That's still damage.
And any order markers on that, he can kill.
Yep, that's still damage that you're expecting Charles to do over the Greenscales. So that's just such a useful tool. Again, so weak to range. I've beaten him with Morrow Warriors, which feels bad. Dysel has a great video showing that happening. Played like 10 rounds against herself with with Charles and Morrow Warriors, and the Morrow Warriors won eventually, which is just so sad. But Charles is a figure that needs a really specific meta to thrive, and if you're wrong in that, you're really going to get punished for it. Doesn't want Raylin, doesn't need Raylin, is obviously going to play like a melee figure. I mean, having Raylin for Counter-Strike is nice, but Charles has no range, so you're still going to be, your opponent is still going to be able to dictate. Even if they have melee, they can still develop outside of Raylin's aura, and if they have range, obviously it doesn't matter. So Raylin pretty useless here, but those are my thoughts on Charles. Super fun to play, both with and against, frankly. I love Charles as a dragon, but yeah, in terms of a king build, definitely requiring a certain formats to thrive, certain formats and point figure limits, and also again a meta read if you have a good guess. Now, this is easier for me for my own locals because again I make like half the armies for players that show up. Not that I would bring Charles if I was going to hand everyone else melee units, but I also make the format, and so I kind of have an idea of what's going to do well. I mean, that's just kind of an advantage of doing that. So you'd have an idea of, if you're looking at your own locals, you should have an idea of whether or not Charles is going to do well, depending on, I think mainly the point and figure limit is a big factor for him. But then also, if you can fit 10th and 4th into a tournament, you just shouldn't bring Charles, because that someone will bring that and you'll be cooked. With that finally wraps up my whole Greenscale spiel. Let's hear from DogginDays. I've given you plenty of time to collect your thoughts, so I expect this will be just a perfect spiel. Let's go through the Nagrubs. and their Hive Lord options and their best builds, all of their versions that you can make. We've got 4 Hive Lords currently in existence. Sorry, I'm mistaken. We have 5. We should actually talk about the newest Hive Lord. I'm not sure if we're prepared to do that. I think we should.
Is that that's
It is the Thoraxis Dragoon. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correct either, but I'm gonna keep doing it.
Yeah, Thyraxis or whatever they call it. Yeah,
Thoraxis.
That's a good point. I had read the card, I'd skimmed it over, and I didn't realize that does work with the Nagrubs. I had just sort of assumed the Nagrubs can only bond with the Morrow Hive Lords, but no, it's any Hive Lord. So I am completely unprepared. I can only theory craft.
That's fine. Now. As long as we have that disclaimer, I think that's okay. We're not going to pretend to rank the Thoraxis Dragoon, although I am going to go and look back because the unit seemed familiar. I'm not totally certain that I didn't rank this one because I don't remember if this was one of the ones I ranked or not. Oh yeah. I've got Thoraxis ranked at A. Now there's a spicy take.
Interesting.
Yeah. We can absolutely talk about Thoraxis Dragoon. Yeah, I did play a couple games. I did play a couple games. It's a cool figure. It's a very cool figure. But yeah, why don't you go ahead and talk about the Hive Lords in any order that you would like. Well, maybe we'll save the new fellow for last because that would be a little less. We're a little less knowledgeable about that one. But yeah, go ahead and start wherever you'd like.
Sure thing. Yeah. So I should say too, I know that there is Kontarna from VC. I know he is a Hive Lord. I don't think I've ever played him, so I'm not equipped to talk about him beyond theory crafting. I have heard he is good, so I can offer speculation. And if you have any experience, I'd be happy to hear about it. But my main wheelhouse is Torkulna Nagrubs, but I do have a little bit with Wosaga and Subakna. I'll just start by saying that Torkulna is the best for this build. Maybe Thyraxis Dragoon, because it looks like Thyraxis has similar stats, so there may be a conversation there. But just from my experience, Torkulna, he is the offensive powerhouse of all of them. Great base attack. Trample Stomp is amazing. And I just think him plus Raylan and Nagrubs, it is just delicious when your opponent has spent several turns just to get one wound on Torkulna, and then you just heal it. So it's delightful. It's probably one of the reasons I come back to it. Just I like it. But I think I'm going to save Torkulna for last and talk about Wosaga and Subakna and kind of why I don't think they're up to snuff. So Wosaga has 2 less life than Torkulna, 1 less defense. Still that nice 6 attack, and she does have the ability to kill a major or a large figure, which is, it's rare when it happens, but when it does, it's pretty cool. It is pretty cool.
Have you managed to? I've never done that. I've only seen it happen once.
I've only seen it.
Okay,
I've never, so rare. Yeah, I've never done it. So it's hard to pull off, but I mean, if you get it, it's like, yeah, it is a real rush. So I'm sure. Can't speak to it myself, but Wosaga just, I don't think has the survivability. Yeah, as a queen, or it's a her, right? I think
so. Yeah,
yeah. But in a king or queen, just doesn't have the survivability needed, because if your opponent understands that your army is a king army, which they will, just because visually it's a huge figure on the board and does the most damage, they're gonna go after your king, and you need to. I just, it doesn't have the stats to withstand the aggro that it's gonna trigger in the opponent. But one thing I do like about Wosaga is she goes down quite a bit in Delta, and that's a conversation we'll have when we get to Torkulna. Torkulna becomes, the Torkulna Nagrubs with Raylan becomes very challenging to field in Delta, because Raylan goes up so much and the Nagrubs go up 5 points. So if you're looking for an army that has more room for extra tech, like extra range or whatever else you want to spec it with, then there might be a way to use Wasaga as a kind of poor man's Torkulna to still do a lot of damage with 6 attack. Ironically, I say poor man. Wasaga's figure is not cheap, but you probably 3D printed that. But.
No. In terms of army building only, yes, yeah,
yes, correct, yeah,
yes.
Right. In terms of points, yeah, I think what is she down to in Delta? Let me see here. In Delta, she is now down she's down to 100, and that's down from 135. So she drops by 35 points. So she can still be your heavy hitting unit, and you still have a ton of points left over to draft in range. So there might be a conversation there. I don't have as much experience with it, but I'll talk a little bit more about why that survivability is so important with the Nagrubs when we get to Torkulna. But yeah, it just not quite up to par with Torkulna. And then there's Subakna. Subakna, I think, has the second highest base attack in the entire game, which is really impressive. And the flying is great too with 6 move. But again, there's a survivability problem, 3 defense, 5 life. He is very easy to take down after enough attrition. I also think he's still pretty expensive. He's 160 in Classic and I think 130 in Delta. And a lot of those points come from that Hive Supremacy power. So I think if you're bringing Subakna, you really want him for an army that's going to mostly benefit from that buff, or like at least half of your army is receiving that buff in some way, minimum. That's just my view on it. And if you're only bringing Subakna with Nagrubs, that's a whole ton of his points that aren't getting used, in the game, because the Nagrubs don't have any need for Hive Supremacy. So there might be something there. And I think there's we mentioned it earlier. One thing I like about the Nagrubs is that you can have multiple Hive Lords in your army. And you can bond with all of them, and they can heal all of them. It's not like the Greenscales where you have to say, okay, this dragon is my chosen Lizard King. The Nagrubs, there could be a build where you bring Subakna and Wasaga for that budget. That's only 230 points. That's close to Torkulna. That could be I've never done it, but I could see that being really useful and having a lot of flexibility. And then also too with this new Thyraxis Dragoon, how much are they? 195. Okay, well maybe not so much that one, but you get the idea there. So I don't think Subakna is quite up to snuff either with this, but really that's all those opinions are based on the opinion I have of Torkulna. I think Torkulna Nagrubs Raylan is just mechanically my favorite army in the game. I just have a ton of fun with it. What it has taught me is that you have to, even when you are buffing Torkulna's defense to 7, even when you're buffing your Nagrubs to 4, tiny little, 10-point figures in Classic, even when you're buffing them to 4 defense, which is great, that's great. To make a 10-point figure 4 defense is great. Even with all those buffs, you have to look at every single one of them in this army as fragile. You have to look at them as brittle, that they can collapse at any moment. And it just forces a lot of, I don't know, it just made me think about the game very differently than a lot of other armies. And because you would not think that Torkulna with 6 lives and 7 defense is fragile, but your opponent knows that if they kill Torkulna, they win. And Torkulna doesn't have any range. In fact, that all 3 of those units, you don't have any range. It's kind of like what we were saying with Charos, Greenscales. There's no range. And that leads into some of the problems with this army. So I can give you my dream army, and I think it's been played before. I'm not the first person to discover this, but in Classic points, if you're going with 500, just anything goes. Torkulna, 3 Nagrubs, Raylan, Krav Maga agents, and I guess Isamu, because there's 10 points left over. The Krav Maga will really benefit from Raylan's aura, and importantly, the Krav Maga bring this army range. And I think one of the joggers we were talking about, you kind of want some range support to threaten an opponent, to bring them closer to you. And that's kind of what I think Torkulna needs if he's going up against range or a melee army. He needs something that pulls the opponent toward, I call it his playground. You have to set up a little spot on the board for him to stomp around and have a temper tantrum in, just crushing everything and playing around with his snacks, and I think that's defined by Raylan, and you had mentioned earlier in a Greenscale Dragon army that has Raylan, you can make or break your entire game based on at what point do you move Raylan or reposition Raylan. It's so incredible how much your entire strategy and success hinges on the turn you spend on Raylan, getting that timing right. And it's hard. It's really hard. Sometimes, if you're lucky, you don't ever need to move Raylan. You just put it at the front of your start zone and maybe you can pull your enemy to you. That's great. Having Krav Maga agents or any range in the army, it at least lets you threaten the opponent from far away and then bring the opponent closer to you so that they enter Torkulna's playground, and then he could just have his fun. You had at one point you'd mentioned earlier about when would I want to bring Torkulna, and this comes into a discussion about maps, like the map pool of a tournament. And I know you had said that there are a lot of competitive maps that don't have a lot of choke points, but there are some maps that do have kind of like corridors, or like there's one jungle, there's a jungle map with like one Rise of the Valkyrie set, and there's kind of like a land bridge in the middle. It's maybe 2 or 3 hexes, and it's great for Torkulna because the opponent doesn't really have, unless he wants to go into water, which usually isn't advised, the opponent doesn't have a lot of opportunity to flank Torkulna and surround him. And Torkulna has like this narrow little corridor that he can just stomp, and then normal attack, and it can be really great. That is one of the things that Torkulna will struggle with is when he gets swarmed by common figures or whatever, or if multiple enemy figures get him in kind of a cross pattern, where if he decides to trample in one direction, he's probably taking like 2 or 3 disengages. It's really rough into knights. That's a horrible matchup for Torkulna. So, but I'm a big advocate of this army, and there are ways to deal with it. And I think it all comes down to those Nagrubs. Like, yes, the Nagrubs are expendable, but I don't think they're that expendable. They're pretty important, and I think I have not run this army at any less than 3 squads of Nagrubs. So maybe there's a conversation about getting 35 extra points to spend elsewhere. Well, they're 30 in Classic, 35 in Delta. But there is, I just think that he needs those grubs to, one, maintain his own survival with healing. But the grubs are going to do a lot of different jobs. Like you can sometimes send one out as a sacrifice to hold up a unit. You can send them out for glyphs. And the other thing that grubs are really important for is if you don't have a natural land or like geographic corridor on the map, the grubs can kind of define that, they can kind of like take up height spots and kind of build sort of like I don't know if I'm describing this well, but sort of like they can kind of influence the opponent to go down, the corridor that they're forming, and you can just kind of set that up for Torkulna. And the other thing I like about them is you can use them to surround Torkulna, not just for his own healing, but to prevent other figures from engaging Torkulna from multiple angles. So the grubs are really, really important in a way that they do similar, but not exactly the same job as Greenscales. They're never going to be your most offensive figure. So they really are just all in support of Torkulna. This is a conversation, I guess, that applies to all Hive Lords, and certainly, I guess, now Thyraxis Dragoon, because Thyraxis Dragoon has 6 life and 5 defense, which is the same as Torkulna. What's really important over the course, from what I've found, is that you want to control bleed. Like, your opponent's going to throw everything they have at Torkulna, and so you want to get Torkulna in a situation where if he's taking a wound, it's maybe 1 or 2 around tops, because you can replenish that with heals, But if your opponent gets into a situation where he puts like 3 or 4 wounds on Torkulna, that's rough, because you're gonna have to eat a lot of grubs, and you can only eat 1 grub per turn. So it can take a long time for Torkulna to heal himself back up. So I think it's really about just kind of designing that playground for him and finding a way to tempt the opponent toward that playground. There's a couple different armies I've played with. There was one event I went to. I think it was VC Delta, and it was a really high point limit. It was like 540 or something, but it opened up a lot of options for what you could bring. And I've played around with like throwing in Tauren into the army so that like you can't you can get like a counter strike against a a Marvin Nagrub with 4 defense. Yeah. Like that's really cool. I didn't run it because Q10 exists, but it just yeah. There's some fun you can do, but it doesn't even necessarily need to be a ranged unit, but you just need some unit that the opponent is anxious about, that forces them, that makes them feel like they have to come to you. And sometimes that can just be done by Tarkulna going back to his playground, healing up, and the opponent's like, "Oh, come on, man! Like, he's healing now. I have to deal with him." So sometimes even like Deadeye Dan, I don't know if I'd run him competitively, but just that threat of insta killing anything at 10 range, that might psych a player out and get them to think, okay, he's just going to keep shooting at me with that stupid cowboy. I gotta come to him, So that's why I like having some range of the army, and I do think the army needs some form of range. But that then leads into the difference in pricing between Classic and Delta. In Classic, you can. This is really due to Raylan, but I have my thing here. Let me add them in. So if you draft, Tarkulna stays the same, thankfully. So he's just 220 points. He's just kind of that's where he's been resting for a while. So if you do 3 squads of Nagrubs, Tarkulna, and Raylan in Classic, so in Classic points, that's 390 points. So that's where you could draft in Krav Maga for 100 and then Isamu for 10. There you go. It's a good army. But then if you switch that to Delta, you have 40 points left over in a 500 point game, And sometimes even there's formats that are like, 450 points or even smaller. So yes, even on points, that can preclude this army from being run. But assuming that kind of standard of 500, which tends to be the case in our locals where I'm from, you have about 40 points left over to spend on range, and that might buy you Guilty McCreech, and that's an option, I guess. But it's tough. It's tough. Yeah. And I remember one time I ran this army where I thought, well, I only have 40 points left to spend. What else can I afford? I'll just throw in another squad of grubs. And that actually can be a good army, but it becomes super matchup dependent. I got smoked twice by a Zeus and Gorillanator Nikita army just because they could decide where the fight happened. And Tarkulna hates that. You want to be the one to decide where the fight happens. You want to say, no, we're fighting here in my playground and you come to me. That's what you want to do. But range will just mess that up completely. And just any unit that can pull apart Tarkulna from Raylan and his grubs, those are rough for him. So yeah, I almost wonder how viable this army becomes in Delta. I think it goes down a lot in its potential in Delta, and it's hard to spec it for what I want it to do. I'm going on a huge tangent here just because this is like the one army I've like really sunk a lot of my time into for this game, but I have tried to do the Swarm of the Morrow Raylan with this army just to save on points. And I just find it doesn't work. It just doesn't work. Tarkulna just loses that survivability. He goes down too fast. The Nagrubs go down too fast with only +1 defense. It is cool that she affects a greater area. That's cool. She can spread out a little bit with Tarkulna, but I just find it doesn't quite make the cut. I think I would rather just spend those extra points on the extra defense over the course of a game. I guess those are just my broad thoughts on Tarkulna Nagrubs, that I think 3 Nagrubs is ideal. Old Raylan is ideal. And then you want some kind of range if you can fit it. If not, you just have to accept that it's going to be very matchup dependent. Now, I will say, to give this army its due, I've used just like pure Nagrubs, Old Raylan, Tarkulna. I've gotten lucky and beaten armies that are range heavy. I have done it before. It's not easy and it's close, but I've done it before. I've also beaten a 4th Mass Knights of Weston army. That wasn't easy either. And Brick had, I think, 1 life at the end, and she just narrowly survived being shot by 4th Mass. So I think that's the reason I won. But if it had just been 1 extra point, she would have died. But if you can keep her alive, if you can keep her clinging on, I was able to survive. And now that leads into another point I have about this army: the trap of Trample Stomp. It can be very tempting if you see a huge mob of common squad or small and medium figures. Just be like, ooh, delicious. Like I'm just going to rush Torkola out and trample. And I've made that mistake before. I've run him out of Raylan's aura to try to go for 6 tramples. Guess what? 6 tramples are probably not happening. Just sorry. It's probably not happening in a game. And even if you're right in the thick of everything, you might get 1 or 2 tramples. And I just think it's important to look at trample stop not as the main reason to draft Torkola, but just a nice occasional bonus if you can get it. It's cool. It gets an auto wound on a small medium hero. It's good. But I have found that Torkola can sometimes just win a game as just a meat sponge. He just sits there, drops 6 attack. He's got a great position. He's backed by Raylan. The opponent can't reach Raylan if you've positioned it all well. And he's got grubs around him, so every time he just soaks up damage, and he's dropping 6 attack. I've won games just never trampling once, just normal attacking with Torkola. It's not often, but it can happen. And I just think don't fall into the trap of going out of your way to trample. Use it if the opportunity arises, great. But it's not the linchpin of your strategy. That's at least my view. And I guess the final point I have on this, I say that now, I'll probably have 20 more. The final point I'll have on this is 99% of the time, if you run Torkola out of Raylan's aura, or if Raylan dies early, he's doomed. If you lose that extra defense too early in a game, Torkola goes down really fast. And that's just kind of that. That's where that idea of Torkola is fragile. He's fragile, even at 7 defense, 6 life. No, just treat him as brittle and protect him. He will do work for you if you protect him, but you have to keep him alive. There may be 1 or 2 cases where I ran Torkola out of Raylan's aura. I can think of one specifically where there was an opponent's Fen Hydra sitting in his start zone, and it was a full life Fen Hydra. The opponent didn't have any order markers on it for that turn. And I thought, okay, well, I better whittle down its life before it gets to me. And I need to take this chance while I have it. So at that point, I did rush Torkola out to get a couple turns chopping off some of the Hydra's heads, so that by the next round, when he put order markers on the Hydra, he only had like 1 or 2 attacks. So that rare cases like that, where it's just a really, really juicy opportunity to do damage, but even then, I think it's questionable. So, something to be said about Subakna Mosaga. Certainly, I don't have any experience with Kantarna, so I'm not qualified to talk about him. But Torkola is my baby, and
I'm happy to briefly brush on Kantarna after this. I don't think he's quite as interesting or as much depth as Torkola. So the reason I wanted you on for this is because I really wanted to pick your brain about this build specifically, because when I listened to, I believe it was your video recapping your 2023 competitive season last year, and you talked about this build, I am fascinated by Raylan in this army. I really am. First of all, I'll say I think it is interesting that you believe that the best version of this army isn't quite technically a king build. With the Krav in there, they slide it just a little bit towards,
I suppose so,
a little bit out of that Venn diagram. But that's true. But I think the same thing about Quahan and Nilfheim. I actually think the best versions of them, and you can play, depending on the format, like if you can only fit 2x Greenscales, Raylan, Quahan in a format, and that's the points, that's probably still taking it. But like there's certain things, it's different for the builds, but certain things add a lot of value to a king build. It might be that king builds just really are, they can just really be so fragile in Heroscape, and it is very often that you find, or maybe on the flip side, it's very rare that you find true king builds in competitive scape because of that risk you run of losing your king, and then the game is over. So that was a really interesting parallel there. I want to pick your brain about this Raylan thing. So Raylan, that's in a melee army, that's really interesting to me. Why do you feel like you would rather take Raylan, and let's use delta pricing here as an example, because you could take 3 squads of Nagrubs for Raylan and delta pricing. It would only be two and like 2/3. Like you wouldn't have the points quite for that third squad. You'd be 10 points short, depending on how things worked out. If you were 10 points under with Raylin, you could take 3 squads. Why take Raylin over 3 squads of Nagrubs? Do you feel like that? Because there's obviously the benefit is there that like you just have way more of the little guys running around. Like Raylin is saving the squads you do have at a pretty consistent rate, but at the same time, you've got literally double sitting in your start zone. So why Raylin over Grubs in your mind? That's what I'm most curious about, I think.
Why not swap out Raylin for even more Grubs?
Yes.
Is that the idea? Okay.
Yes. Instead of playing it like, because then not that you necessarily limit yourself to Raylan's Aura. I mean, you gave an example where you run out of it, but you're not playing with the idea that, I need to be here. I need to have the fight come to me. If I don't necessarily have the points for the Krav, I've got the freedom to just run around with a bunch of these Nagrubs who are pretty fast.
Oh yeah,
are able to keep up. So yeah, so why, when you're building this army, I mean your ideal army, why Raylin over Grubs? I'm very curious.
Sure, yeah, and take what I say with a grain of salt. I've only been doing this for like a year, so I could be wrong, but I think it comes down to the opponent understands how important Torkulna is to your army. So it's a huge figure on the board. He just draws your eye when you look at a map. And I think the opponent just will understand, I have to kill that creature. And I have found that if an opponent throws enough attacks at Torkulna, like you had said specifically this in a melee format, like extra Grubs and Torkulna in a melee only format. I don't have experience with that personally, so I'm not even qualified to answer that. But I could sort of speculate on why I still would not. I would still prefer to have Raylin in that, because, with things like initiative switches where you could try to be impeccable with your Nagrub placement, there's probably going to be an opening somewhere your opponent can exploit. And if they get the jump on you with an initiative switch, they can engage Torkulna and start attacking him. And I think the other thing too is Torkulna obviously is a very mobile unit. He can only ever activate 3 Grubs in a turn along with him. And so I find a lot of times if you have so many Grubs on the board, if you have more than 9 Grubs on the board, sometimes it takes several turns just to get the rest to catch up to Torkulna wherever he's going, especially if you're not using this like playground camp idea where you're being a bit more aggressive with Torkulna and rushing him towards the opponent. Well, remember, your Grubs have to keep up with Torkulna, and you have to spend, so like you might, and Grubs without Raylin, anything could kill him, so
a gust of wind, yeah.
Yeah, and so you could engage the opponent with Torkulna, but you might have only 2 Grubs that have kept pace with him, and by then you're closer to the opponent's army, and the opponent can swarm you, and then it's that many more turns that the Grubs need to catch up with Torkulna, especially since Torkulna needs to, in order to heal, a Grub has to start the turn adjacent to him. Like a Grub can't move into Torkulna and then kill itself to heal him. You have to start Torkulna's turn next to at least 1 Grub in order to pull that off. And so if only a couple have made it to the opponent could probably finish off all those Grubs in that turn and isolate Torkulna from the rest of the Grub pack as they catch up with him. So again, that's theory crafting. I haven't tried it, but that's where I feel like you want to make those Grubs, the few Grubs you have, a little bit tougher. Because I think when you get over 3 squads of Grubs, you start seeing diminishing returns on them, and it becomes hard to manage that huge volume of little figures when all of them have to support Torkulna. And at that point, then that's when the idea of Raylin starts coming in. It's like, okay, well, if I'm starting to see diminishing returns after 3 squads, let's draft in Raylin to make both her and those 3, valuable squads even tougher. And 3 squads gets the job done. And sometimes I wish I had more, obviously, if Torkulna is taking a ton of damage, or if I need one to grab a glyph. but I usually find that rounds it all off, and it becomes hard to manage, I think, is my biggest issue with that, just in theory. That many more grubs, it's tough for them to have them all keep up with Torkulna. And if the argument is, well, don't be so aggressive with Torkulna, try to like move him carefully and conservatively with the grubs, you know, so like don't rush him forward, kind of move him slowly and make sure a ton of grubs are slowly moving with him. I'm all for it. I think this is an army that does benefit from playing conservatively and playing carefully. But at that point, I'm like, well, if you're already playing conservatively, if you're already, you know, kind of being slow, you're slow rolling with Torkulna and all his grubs. Well, at that point, I just feel it disposes itself to Raylin, you know? So
right.
It's kind of my long-winded answer to your very short question.
No, well, and the question is challenging. It's interesting that you mentioned that the matchup with just grubs without Raylin is it can be very matchup dependent. It feels like even with Raylin, range still is very tough, just because you have the ability to just say, you can sit in Raylin's aura, eventually I will pull you out. There is nothing you can do about it. But maybe that's why the Krav are necessary in order to mitigate that, which you could do with and without Raylin if you have the points, I suppose.
Yeah. And that's just the unfortunate reality with Delta now, is that it precludes that from that build from happening. And it's a damn shame, but it's the way it is. I still also feel like, even though I've often lost with Torkulna against range, I didn't lose quite as bad in some cases as I thought I might have. And it's, you know, again, you want to win your games. You don't want to like kind of modestly lose. But I feel like one thing you can do is, I guess, use Raylin as that bait for the opponent's range. Without Raylin, if you're just grubs, then the opponent they just go after grubs and Torkulna. But the opponent may understand that Raylin is important for that army, so I guess you can kind of use her as bait. But yeah, you do need some form of range. And one version of the army I had thought about in that higher point limit was including Rygarn. So Rygarn has a ranged attack, and he has that flexibility of, okay, well, this is the turn now. I need to move Raylin. I previously thought it was turn 1, but turns out it's not. I'm going to move her on turn 2. You know, and you can use that flexibility with Rygarn. But again, it's an expensive army. It doesn't fit cleanly. So I think in Delta, you do have to make some concessions. It might be you swap old Raylin for Swarm of the Mara Raylin. You might drop an extra squad of grubs. And you're probably not running Krav Maga. It's sad to say. But yeah, that's where I do feel you need some kind of range to pull the enemy towards you. Because as you said, you could just shoot my figures, you know, even if they're being buffed by Raylin, eventually you'll get through, and then I'll realize I have to come to you,
right?
Which Torkulna hates. So, yeah, no, it breaks my heart, man. It breaks my heart.
Playing range. Well, and on that note, slightly switching from army building now to actual play, and this is something. This is the tip of the iceberg for another discussion I'd love to have on the stratagems here. Targeting Torkulna versus targeting the grubs. And we can consider both with and without Raylin. The obvious benefit to targeting Torkulna is that if I get a really high attack and you roll low on defense, I can do multiple wounds to you, which then is multiple turns and multiple Nagrubs you need to remove from the board. The obvious downside to that is that you have 3 more base defense dice than the Nagrubs do, and you have 7 defense dice with Raylin, 8 with height, which is crazy. And so the odds that I do multiple wounds to you become extremely low anyway. So maybe this is a different conversation with and without Raylin. Where have you seen... Well, first of all, what do you feel as a player? Like, what are you most worried about happening? And then where do you see your opponents make mistakes or maybe make the correct plays in targeting Torkulna versus targeting the grubs around him to keep him from healing, keep multiple attacks up the board? but then maybe I roll 4 skulls every time and the grubs take 3 damage, but it was a waste because it was a 10-point figure anyway.
I tend to think it's better to go for the grubs because and again, take it with some salt. There's probably far better Torkola players out there than I, but almost certainly. that sounded incredibly arrogant. Forgive me, but you're just generally more likely to do damage against the grubs, and I know that's kind of it's annoying, because it's like I want to kill Torkola, I don't want to get rid of grubs, but by killing the grubs, and I would say you eventually do want to switch to attacking Torkola. A lot of times, like even when I'm just running 3 squads of grubs, there's still going to be a couple grubs that just inevitably get left behind at my base or at my start zone. So I would, if I was playing against this army, I would want to clear out the grubs that are immediately next to Torkola, and then once those are dealt with, start going for Torkola as he's trying to get the rest of his grubs to catch up. I would not want to go for Torkola while he is being buffed by Raylan and adjacent to a bunch of grubs. I just wouldn't. What I might prefer to do is, if possible, engage Torkola, get him into that cross pattern so that he's locked down, he's not going anywhere. Then start shooting at a couple. It's not, you can't pull it off ideally, but it's kind of the dream. I would then want to start killing grubs that are adjacent to Torkola. I'm more likely to do damage into them. Maybe more realistically, if I can get a shot at Raylan, I'm going to go for her.
Sure.
But the grubs, I think you're more likely to do the damage, so you're less likely to kind of waste a turn. And you are also eliminating the units that can kind of protect the spaces around Torkola, which makes it easier for you to then surround Torkola with your own figures and make it harder for him to trample stomp. Because one thing I do like doing with the grubs is maybe like move Torkola up, give him maybe 1 or 2 hexes that he can stomp forward into that are open, but then surround his sides with grubs so that the opponent has to attack the grubs instead of Torkola. I don't know if that answers your question. I have to think about it a little more, but that's generally, I would say I would still want to go for the grubs just because I know it's damage I know I can do. Now, if I can get Torkola into a place where he doesn't have any grubs next to him and I have some attacks on him, I'm definitely going for him. If there are grubs that sort of spread out across the map and he doesn't have any adjacent to him, I'm going to him, because that means I can start getting the wound momentum on my side. If I only get like 1 wound through 7 defense, well, he's just going to heal that right up, and he's going to feel like I've done nothing. But if I can put 2 or 3 wounds on him, and then the next turn he can't heal, he might have to run or move grubs next to him, but he can't heal after I've put those wounds on him. Suddenly, the momentum starts shifting in my favor. You know what I mean?
Yeah. That is really interesting. I feel like I think that's enough of a different conversation that we'll leave it there. There's a lot that goes into targeting support figures versus targeting what's attacking you. I mean, this is like a classic conundrum, even playing against like orcs or knights or anything like that. Yeah, but that's an interesting answer, and I'm curious because I don't play with or against Torkola too much, and I also don't play with or against Katarna too much, but I have played enough and seen enough to speak on him briefly. Katarna is a VC Hive Lord with much lower survivability. Katarna has 5 life and 4 defense. Katarna has an interesting little movement ability where he can move less than 4 spaces and then choose an opponent's figure within 3 sight spaces and be placed on any space adjacent to him, so he's able to leap over screens, leap around ruins and things like that. And he also has the potential for a double attack. If he destroys an opponent's figure, he can attack an additional time, and he can also use the leaping assault in that time. So he can make a kill, move 3 spaces or more, actually, because you can choose an opponent's figure and then put them on a hill on the other side of them and move like an effective 6 spaces or something crazy. And with an attack of 5, he is going to get Taste of Blood pretty consistently. Now, the big downside to him is that, like some high-powered figures in Heroscape, you expect them to get the kill every time. You expect them to get that like attack of whatever to go through. As soon as you roll that 1 for 5 and he doesn't get that taste of blood, you're setting up for this crazy leaping, like clearing the path. That's painful because that's 2 kills you effectively didn't get per turn. If you miss the first one, you don't get the opportunity for the second one. So that is his big drawback, is that there's a chance to just get totally stalled. And he's also like, unlike Torkalna, who is maybe a little less susceptible to melee defensive figures like Warriors of Ashra, or even like Warforged potentially, like Warforged and Raylin. Really difficult for Kantarna to kill because he doesn't have any tech to deal with that, whereas Kantarna has that trample stomp and that auto wound. Oh man, that is sweet into so many things. And Kantarna doesn't have that. The big upside to Kantarna, 150 points in classic pricing, which is pretty good, honestly. That's a decent deal considering how much better he is than Wasaga and Subakna, at least for a king build, and just so much cheaper than I think 60 points cheaper than Torkalna in classic, which is a lot. I mean, that is a lot.
It is, and I'm just looking at it now. It kind of motivates me to want to try this in a competitive format, because that it would save me on the points needed to draft that important rage unit to pull someone.
Yeah,
and it does sort of seem like Kantarna functions somewhat similarly to Torkalna in that he wants a little area he could jump around and have his fun in.
Yeah.
So I have not played it, but I'm intrigued, and I think 5 life 4 defense. It's not great. But it is serviceable. If you protect him well enough. I can see him lasting a good long time.
Yeah, with Raylin, I guess I've never tried him with Raylin, and that's an interesting thought. He's super fun to play. I will say, if you're a fan of Nagrubs, if you're a fan of Hive Lords, this was such an excellent SOV design, actually, which is fantastic. So yeah, that's a really cool unit. I think this is a little bit meta. I think, unfortunately, the figure is very difficult to find, if I remember.
Very, very, very difficult to find. I have looked.
Okay.
Like, one of the reasons I have not played it is because I can't find him.
Mine is 3D printed.
I think that's how you have to go.
It's truly like, it's out there. It's not. Yeah, and even if you could find one, it might be extremely expensive. So that is the downside to this, unfortunately. If you play online, and this is my invitation to any listeners, absolutely do it. It's the best way to get better at the game. You don't have to worry about your wallet, but yeah, 3D printing is the way to go for this guy. Just like Wasaga, actually. So they have that in common, which is kind of nice. They both are ridiculously real life expensive, even if they're much cheaper than Torkalna in the game. Kantarna has useless without Raylin, does have some survivability issues. And again, Taste of Blood can just completely, if you miss the attack, that's the end of your offensive output for the turn. Nagrubs aren't doing much, and then it can snowball from there. So that's really his downside, is he can hit the wall with one bad roll and just take 3 or 4 wounds from that 2 turns where he didn't do any damage. I think let's take a look at this new Hive Lord. Yeah. We have a new potential for a king build. This is really cool. Renegade just released their designs for the upcoming Wave 3 in the spring and late spring. Among those were the organized play promos for the next year, one of which was the Thraxis Dragoon, which is not a Morrow Hive Lord, actually. The Nagrubs don't specify. It's only Hive Lord. It's a Skjordir Hive Lord, which again, I'm probably not saying right, but I don't care, and I'm going to
that's your guess is as good as mine.
I don't. There's too many. Yeah, that's just too many consonants next to each other. I don't know. But he is a Hive Lord, which is super cool. And so he bonds with Nagrubs. Now there might be some synergy in the future with other AOA units. It seems like this Skjordir faction maybe was complete enough for the box set that it was intended to be in, but might have some stuff on the way. I know I spoke with Rod Phelps recently, Sky Knight, one of the designers of AOA. I unfortunately did not ask about future plans for the bugs, and I'm not sure if he could have even told me with his NDA. But the Hive Lord is obvious direct synergy to classic Nagrubs, which is so cool. I mean,
it is.
The people that made this game are incredible. And I know one of the Avalon Hill designers was a huge Torcolna fan. Doc.
Oh, cool.
Doc is a huge fan of Torcolna. I actually just played against him with Torcolna Nagrubs last weekend. I
remember reading on the old forums, there was like some battle reports about a big tournament or whatever. And I think it was Doc's post that I read where he was talking about that ideal Krav Maga, Grubs, Torcolna Raylin army. And he talked about all the different fights he went into it. And I was like, okay, I'm glad someone else likes him. This is great.
Yeah, I know. So, and he was on the design team along with Sky Knight. So this was like 100% intentional. Like they wanted to build something that competed with Torcolna because the stat line is so similar. So 6 live, 6 move, 1 range, 5 attack and 5 defense. So not quite the same there. 1 less attack, but then also only 195 points. So a little bit of compensation there. Slightly cheaper in classic.
Almost a squad of grubs.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Wildly different abilities, which we can go through here in a second.
Yeah,
but like, yeah, super similar stat line, very similar pricing. Another it's a huge 8-figure. It's terrifying as the personality, really cool sculpt. So it's got a big thing being ridden by a smaller thing. Like like so many parallels. Such a cool sculpt, such a cool design. So. Would you want to read the abilities here for Thoraxis?
Sure, yeah. So first is Maddening Chitter 14. Once per round, before taking a turn with the Dragoon, you may choose an enemy figure within 6 clear sight spaces of Thoraxis and roll the d20. If you roll a 14 or higher, you may look at one unrevealed order marker on that figure's army card. You may then choose any other figure controlled by the same player and move the order marker to that figure's army card, which is wild. And then Battle Frenzy 16, so same as I think Manalvi has this. And doesn't the Frost Giant of Lore have Battle Frenzy?
Yes.
Yeah. So after attacking with the Dragoon, roll the d20. If you roll a 16 or higher, you may attack again with Cyraxis.
So, very cool d20 abilities. To start the discussion here, I will say you mentioned controlling the bleed of your Hive Lord, controlling, trying to limit the amount of damage that they can take per turn because the Nagrubs can only heal 1 wound once per turn. And as soon as that gets more, you've still got damage left on the card. Maddening Chitter 14, I love that description because Maddening Chitter 14 is such a cool way to control the bleed there. I mean, that's such a strong, if you can swap an order marker on the Knights onto their like Quintella Gwyn filler in the start zone, like, oh my God, that's so strong. That's insane. I love that. And even if there's no filler, putting it onto Sir Gilbert instead, where all you can do is move a couple Knights and then kind of just sit there.
Right.
Man, that's such a great way to control the damage you take. Now, it is a little D20 dependent, but 14 or higher is very strong. Very good. That's not as low as 15. You think. Yeah, it's not as low as you think, especially because you can, it's only once per round, but man, could that be critical if you've got it's before taking your turn, so it can be a little, it's hard to necessarily predict when the ideal time is that you want it, and I think that's a good balance. But Yeah,
It's a little like Dune, where like you have to set Dune up the turn prior before you try it, and that's a real challenge to using Dune, and I can see that being a challenge here. But this, unlike Dune, this one gets some bonding and will probably develop pretty well onto the board and open up to I mean,
yeah. Well, it's so sturdy.
I didn't even think of that. Yeah, I didn't even
So
think of that. Where what is it? You could just switch an order marker off of a bonding squad onto the bonding hero.
Yeah.
Like, imagine how frustrating that would be for the opponent. Like, unbelievable. So yeah, no, it's great.
Well, and unlike Dune, the range on this is actually slightly higher. 6 range is pretty nice. That's pretty nice. That matches a lot of range squads. Yeah, 6 range is a lot. That's because if you've got Raylan, you can still maddening chitter all the way out of her aura, halfway across the center of the map. There, it's such a cool way to control how much damage you're taking, and you can do it every round, once per round. You could just absolutely devastate the efficiency of an army.
Yes, and I do think this will, I think, frighten an opponent more. It might make them be more aggressive in trying to kill the Dragoon, instead of like Torkolna, because this Dragoon has some form of range effect, not range attack, but like you could, as you said, you could move Thyraxis just to the edge of Raylan's aura, keep him within it, and then fire out that maddening chitter, and that is a form of like, come to me.
Yeah.
Like, so
100%. Yeah, while you're trying to develop, like, you're just sitting there trying to develop your Nagrub safely, you're still effectively. And the other thing is, you don't just get to move the order marker, you do actually get to look at it, which could be very important, because if you see it's the 3 and you're like, okay, I still got to do some stuff before the round ends, but at least X. Yeah. Well, but see, you still know. You still know is the thing. There's no guessing game, because there's some other abilities that can move order mark, like do some order marker stuff, remove order markers, but often it's without looking. Like, you just pick at random and it's gone, and you don't actually know if you got the X. There's absolutely a chance you did. Spiders are one, for example. You don't get to look at the order marker, you just get to remove it. Yeah, but here, like, you actually get to look.
If your opponent has siege and you take off an X off of him and move that, it's like, oh, you can't crag. There you go.
Yeah. No, it's very good. And I do actually have them in my Age of Annihilation rankings as an A. Now, I'll say here, my rankings, unlike any other rankings, actually have an S tier. So it's not just A+ and A. I would attribute, the A more to maybe an A- that would be in other tiers. And they're floating on the bottom. They might be close to an A-, but for their stat line and what they're able to do. And again, maddening chitter is, when it procs, wow, is it strong. I mean, wow, is it strong. Because you just get to play 2/3 of the turns that the Raxus Dragoon does. Like, it's so crazy. And then Battle Frenzy 16 is obviously, like, if you can get a solid attack on a key figure, especially if, like, well, I know you don't have an order marker 2 anymore because it's on Isamu back in your start zone now. I'm just gonna go run in and hit Sir Gilbert, and if I get the Battle Frenzy, he's gone. 2 attacks of 5. True. He's toast. And then I've got a free order marker to get back out of there. He's great. 195 points too. He's got a little bit of a discount from Torkolna.
I can't believe I briefly scanned these cards when they released, and I just saw Hive Lord, and in my mind I was like, oh, that's a neat callback to Hive Lords, but he can't bond with the groups because he's not Morrow. And now that I know that he can, I'm honestly just going to start proxying him and playing him on my own board.
Oh, absolutely.
Put a little a wyvern there and just start playing around with him.
I'm very excited for him. I do think like Torkolna, he might be best with a ranged component still.
Yeah.
I guess
but you have a little bit more room to squeeze that in now.
That's true. Yeah, you saved 15 points there. That could be that's not insignificant, and we'll see what happens to him in Delta 2. That's a whole other conversation. But
25 points, right? Because Torkolna's 220. So
Yeah. I will also add like in AOA only formats, or like even in Renegade pricing, which is going to happen in all Renegade events, I think. I don't think they use classic pricing because I think all the AOA stuff would get outclassed. But Thoraxis Dragoon, oof. Yeah. Oh man. It's such good stats. Battle Frenzy, crazy good onto like unique squads. Because you could come in and kill 2 different bears, or 3, or 4.
Yeah.
I mean, the possibilities are endless. You could just keep rolling Battle Frenzy until you've killed everything
You can change
in range. Like, yeah, that's so good. And then, of course, yeah, Maddening Chitter, moving that off of the Frost Claws onto Knight Irene instead is, I mean, that just completely stunts anything you want to do.
That's it's remarkable.
Yeah,
it's really impressive.
So very cool. And 14, yeah, once per round, 14 threshold limits it a lot, because one thing about this ability, just from like almost like a tournament director perspective here, or just a player perspective, it's not super fun to not get to take turns in this game. So that's why like abilities that remove order markers are very, very limited, and the figures that use them aren't super great all the time. And it's a high roll to get it, because it's an interesting mechanic, but it's not the most fun for the other player to like not get to take their turns. So yeah, that's I think this is a reasonable balance. It might hurt if they, the first turn of the round they get it every time and you're not like you're not even playing the game. But
I'm just trying to think of what it would be like playing against it, and all of the like nervousness I would feel.
Oh my god, yeah, the intensity of that.
Like, oh my god, he's gonna mess me up. Like you almost like you don't feel safe putting all your markers on your bonding squad. You just sort of like, well, now I got to put all of my figures kind of close to the fray in case he switches on any of them.
Yeah,
so I can at least make some value out of that turn if he gets a switch.
And that's the other thing. If you've got like bonding knights with Gilbert and then like a ranged support piece, if you're about to start the game, there's not going to be any question about whether that ranged piece is going to come out, because you're going to put the X on the figures that you're planning to take a turn with, whether it's like knights, or maybe you have maybe you have guilty that you want to like lead with the kite or something, like some other like opening that you could do. Well, no, it's obvious now, because you're not going to split order markers, because that just makes it more likely that Thoraxis is going to get something important where that X is. You don't want to come in, put 3 on knights and X on Savaris to maybe think, oh, I might be setting up a ranged screen. No, that's not something you can do anymore. You're just going to telegraph. Although I guess, maybe the order marker moves to Savaris anyway, and you're fine with that. But there's some really interesting things that I think new players especially are going to struggle to play against this, to be able to mitigate that order marker thing. But even in a bring one where 99% of the time or more, you always want to get as many points as you can. So you're always going to stuff Isamu or Marku or Guilty or something in, so you can just get the most amount of value out of your points.
And that's
they're going to be susceptible around this. Yep, they're taking more turns than you thought. They're not filler anymore. They're a core part of your offense. Yeah. So very, very cool figure.
Yeah, I agree. Super excited.
Yeah.
The for this unit specifically, hype is very real.
Yes. Hopefully, yeah. I've ranked them at an A. I honestly think they might be a little bit lower, at least in classic pricing.
I kind of think so too.
And Renegade pricing, we'll see.
Yeah.
I want to avoid the Deadeye Dan effect, which is what I call the massive over-ranking of new units. It just because of hype.
Yeah,
we're very excited for Thoraxis Dragoon. It's not. It will still struggle into range for sure.
Yes, and
all the same problems as Torkalna.
All the on my silly little channel, like whenever I do like those tier lists, it's really more just like
I just sort of use the tier list as a framework to kind of get my thoughts out about a particular unit, and I do try to play a few games with everything that I am ranking on that.
That's great. Yeah,
right.
That's huge.
I don't want to just look at the card and theory craft. So it could turn out that Dragoon is not as amazing as Riving Matsu, but that's why I want to proxy him and start playing him. At home. Before he gets out. But yeah, first impressions are very strong.
Yeah, I hope the Deadeye Dan effect is limited on this one. I think, and interesting, because it's lacking some of the tech that Torkolna has. I almost wonder if like a pair of black wormlings at 60 points or 70 maybe the delta is for something to get through like Warforged or Ashra, something that battle like 5 attack is worthless against like Ashra, or like what else has the like any sort of defensive ability that lets you jump out of the way. Red Mantis Blade Dancers,
Red Mantis,
Microcore, that type of stuff. Like some other way to deal with that.
That can just stomp.
Yes. Vanish is a huge problem. Yeah, so black wormlings might actually be a decent little pair with Thorexis, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Very, very cool unit. This will be a little more casual ending to this episode because Doggin and I realized that we had a lot more to say about this topic than we thought. So we are actually going to cut up our discussion for now. And we will be back with the part 2 to cover all of the other builds that we haven't covered yet. That episode will probably be a little bit shorter because we obviously had to espouse our love for our pet armies here.
Yeah, and we got like the 2 biggest groups of these Kang armies out of the way, and it turns out we both feel very fondly about.
Yes. So if you're listening to this, thanks for sticking around. We will be back for a part 2 in a little bit. More King builds with DogginDays. Keep an eye out for that episode. In the meantime, keep on scaping. I would encourage you to go to your local tournaments, as playing Heroscape is the best way to get better at competitive scape. And if there is no local tournament in your area, well, you can just do what I did and start your own. With that being said, we will close down this episode. Thank you very much, Doggin.
Yeah, absolutely. Looking forward to the future.